Good morning, everyone. This is Andrew Smith with the Atlanta Regional Commission. Thank you for joining us this morning. Hopefully everyone can see and hear me just fine, but I really appreciate everybody's participation today. We're really excited to have you. Again, my name is Andrew Smith. I'm a principal planner with the Atlanta Regional Commission, and welcome to Economic Development 101. This training is really brought to you as part of ARC's Community Planning Academy, or CPA. CPA has been a part of ARC's work since really late 90s, early 2000s. And the sort of signature offering that many of you may be most aware of is our annual training for planning officials, which is primarily aimed at appointed or citizen planners in our region. For example, members of local planning commissions, zoning appeals boards, historic preservation commissions, you name it. Many of those folks come into their roles without, a formal background in planning and zoning, and our annual training offers that and also exposes those participants to, bigger picture regional issues that may impact their communities. This training today is part of our effort to really complement and supplement that annual offering by bringing back more focused trainings that are spread throughout the year. The vision for this session in particular was really to better connect the dots between the areas of planning and economic development. This really aiming to help professionals and citizen or volunteer folks in those different arenas understand each other's roles, understand each other's processes, tools, where each of those sort of arenas are coming from, and getting economic development done and getting projects done, and really how those areas fit together. So we hope that you find today's program beneficial in your work. I do want to take just a minute to thank a few folks who were really instrumental in bringing this vision of ours to reality, namely Deanna Murphy and Nick Miller with Sizemore Consulting, Lynn Patterson with B+C Studio, Jeff Kosky with KB Advisory Group, and last but not least, Jared Lombard and Molly Bogle, and our manager, Sam Shimbaga, here at ARC. With that, I'm going to hand it off to Lynn Patterson, and thank you again, everybody. Happy you're here.
Good morning. Thank you, Andrew. Good morning, everybody. I'm really thrilled to be here. Again, I'm Lynn Patterson. I work with BNC Studio. I also have my own firm, 3 Points Planning, where I do economic development and planning consulting. So a couple of my clients, City of Hapeville is one of my main planning communities, so you'll hear me maybe reference them a little bit. I also do economic development around the state, doing economic development plans and strategies, et cetera. My career, just a brief bit about me, has spanned from the developer side, the private side, to the public side. I was an economic development director, downtown development director, to the academic side. I was a full-time faculty member at KSU, Kennesaw State, for a long time, and now I teach at Georgia Tech in their planning program and do consulting. So I want to kick us off because it is such a pleasure to be here. And again, sort of thank you to ARC and the Community Planning Academy for allowing us to put together this curriculum. As Andrew said, this is a really exciting opportunity for me as someone who straddles both the planning world and the economic development world, about pulling back that curtain about what economic developers do and where there's an opportunity and a role for planners. So if we had a subtitle for ED 101, it would be, planning and economic development collaboration. So we'll walk through this today with a terrific group of speakers that are going to share their expertise and their insights and their processes to help pull back that curtain so that you can have a better understanding of economic development and where your role as planners fits in. So we'll walk through that. Let me start to tell you who we've got, and I'm going to encourage you time and time again. I'll be repetitive, almost annoying about it, but I really want you to think about what's the role for planners? What's your role in bringing economic development to communities? All right, let's see if I can get it to the next page. And thanks again to Sizemore Group. So here are our speakers. We've got, like I said, a terrific lineup. We've got Rob LeBeau from Atlanta Regional Commission, who's going to talk about the benefits of economic development to communities from a planning perspective, from maybe some of the less traditional aspects and where there's some disconnects. Samir Abdullahi is going to talk about business retention and expansion opportunities in your communities. You know, we're often concerned about vacancy rates and land use, and we've already got these businesses in play, and he's going to talk about really how to bring those activities, how the economic developers engage in those activities and opportunity for planning. Jeff Kosky will talk about economic development tools, including density and redevelopment, but also TADs and bonds, and just familiarize you with a couple of the economic development tools that are really key for planning, but you may not have that great of an understanding. And if you do, that's fantastic. Maybe you and your community work really, really well together. And this is just you've got lots of information to share, or maybe this is an area where you think your community can be a little tighter. Christopher Pike will lead us off with sort of how economic development gets done. We've got a great panel with Steve Foster and Sherlyn Fortson to talk about the realities of projects, timelines, again, sort of what's the role of planners. And then Kevin Johns will help us bring it all back together with some practical strategies. So it's a fantastic opportunity. Sorry, and I will introduce them as the speakers change, give you a little bit more about them individually. We've got just a session schedule. We'll start out, I'm going to talk a little bit, put everybody on the same page when it comes to economic development. You know, how are we defining? What does it look like? What does it matter to us as planners? As I mentioned, then Rob will take over about the benefits. Samir will talk about the business retention and expansion efforts. We'll take a little break, a little bio break, a little quick phone call break. Everybody can stretch. I was talking to somebody who was in a grant boot camp yesterday, and they literally had 1 5-minute break for about a 7-hour class. So we're not going to do that to you. We want you to be able to, do what you need to do, but not miss any great content. As I said, Jeff will kick it off after our break, and then we'll do the panel and then the wrap up. Now, I think one of the things, and we've all been in this pandemic world, and we're moving into post-pandemic world where we're on Zoom, you've been on them a million times. We want to really have this be as interactive as possible. So we'd like for you to use the Q&A function, which you'll see down in the bottom of your screen. If you've got questions for our speakers, we've asked them to each allow time for questions. And so go ahead and put those in. We're monitoring that Q&A function so that we can help ask those questions of their speakers at the end. But we also have some sort of live interactive pieces. One, you may be asked to put some ideas into a chat. So if that's the case, just click your chat button next to the Q&A. Another is that we have Poll Everywhere embedded in. We've got some really fun word clouds. 12:30, Dave, just so you know, it popped up on my screen. I'm not going to try to do that, but we've got word cloud opportunities, so we can get lots of people's ideas up on the screen. It helps our speakers tailor some of their comments, because again, we're trying to make this as interactive and engaging as possible. We also have a couple of polls, and we ask you if you could participate. It's a lot more interesting and fun that way. So I think I'll get started in my section. What is economic development and what does it matter to planners? So we have a twofold purpose. When you leave here today, you should really feel like you've got a baseline understanding of what economic development is, and it's rudimentary, it's fundamental processes. This is going to help you. Our second point is to really identify opportunities for planning to integrate with economic development. When we're trying to implement plans and programs, or we've got ED folks that are out there recruiting business or working on expansions, we don't want any hiccups between the two. So the closer that we work together, the more collaboration that we have, I think is going to create these wonderful opportunities for communities to engage in better quality of life and all of these things that I'm going to talk about in just a second. One of the things that I that I think is really important is that you'll see some things that are really repetitive because we're really trying to drive home these points about the processes. So all of our speakers, they may touch again, time and time again on some basic processes, but their experiences are different depending on the industry, depending on the community. Those are things that we want to make sure that you're taking in. You know, there is no one size fits all economic development, and there's no, just like there's no one size fits all planning. And so, you know, thinking about how do these processes or tools apply to your community in your specific instances, and we'll walk through those. So here's our first test about our poll. I would love for you to just with one word, if you want to put 2 words, you certainly can. If you have an idea like, I don't know, a 2-word phrase, just put a dash between it because otherwise the word cloud is going to just put them up separately. But go ahead and in our poll now, text or thank you. You all are wonderful about doing that. If you can put it in the poll on your phone or via the web with those instructions, we'll start to see how do you define economic development in your community. I've got a couple. There we go. It's all live, right? You can all see it. For those folks putting it in the chat, if you're able to put it into that CDE V555 on your phone or on the poll, that'd be great. And then that will get us into our word cloud to start to see it over and over again. I've seen a lot of jobs, growth. As you can see, you know, you all know with the word cloud, the more often something comes up, the larger the word is. We're giving another maybe 10 to 15 seconds, throw your words in there. And what we love about this, and we really also encourage you to participate, is that, you know, this is an outcome. We'll be able to save these results to see, to help even with Community Planning Academy wants to follow up on any of the ideas, we welcome those as well. So words that I'm seeing, growth, jobs, opportunity, improvement, business, infrastructure, placemaking, vision. What I love about this is it also shows us that there's not one definition for economic development, especially when it comes to our planning community and those folks that may be part of it. Job creation. Let's see, what else do we have? Finances, retention, tax base, prosperity. Commercial, wealth. All right. You are welcome to continue on, but I'm gonna, I think, move along. So I've got opportunity, jobs, growth, etc. Let's look at some definitions. So I want to walk through this with you kind of briefly because I think it's important. The traditional definition of development, I've been doing development a long time, over 25 years, and you know, it's always been sort of a quantitative measure. And again, what we're trying to do here is help you understand the economic developer's perspective and that field's perspective and how you can participate. You know, they get measured, these folks are measured on the number of businesses they bring in, the number of jobs that are created, the amount of investment. It's a very quantitative, historically has been a very quantitative, you know, approach. We've got, you know, wealth creation is another piece of it. And I saw that you know, we've got creating wealth in the community by increasing the tax base. Economic growth, grow your community. recruit new businesses, industrial development. These, if you were to sort of go back in the last 50, 60, 70 years, really sort of the last 50 economic development started to emerge back then. We're looking at these large infrastructure projects. Those are still the case. We still have all of these very traditional definitions. And any of my colleagues who are going to talk a little bit later, I'm sure they can, they'll certainly reference all of these metrics are very important. But what has happened over time is that we now have a much more modern and holistic definition. It's not only quantitative, but it's qualitative. We're starting to look at the quality of the jobs that are being created. We're starting to say, is it just good for any business to come in? Or are there certain businesses that we're looking at, certain businesses we want to attract, businesses that improve our community? This is going to matter when economic developers are putting together packages and responding to RFPs, which the speakers are going to talk about when they get those. Is this an industry that really fits and is really suitable for the community? Wealth creation is there, but it's not just general wealth creation. It's really looking at inequality reduction. How do we start to look at economic development? And this is where, to me, it so closely addresses the planning, our initiatives as planners, and really looking at sort of our social impact as well as our economic impact. How are we making sure that we're addressing livable wages and we're anti-poverty and we're trying to create good career mobility and opportunity for people? How are we diversifying our local economy so that we have a resilient economy, not only in terms of diversity and job types, but also in workforce? Rob will probably mention this when he talks about workforce development, but making sure that we have, a workforce that is agile and flexible, and we have those resources in our community to be able to address when there's a change in the market. If you have a large industry closed down, how flexible are your institutions for retraining? How flexible is your workforce? We start to see, and I saw sustainability on our word cloud, sustainable resource use and production. Who are you trying to attract? Are we trying to attract those green industries, those clean industries into our communities, and overall community development? So it really has, instead of those first couple, qualitative wealth creation, we're starting to expand, and that's what this, I think this program today will share some of the perspectives of our colleagues. So let's just take a look at that modern holistic definition, really increasing the tax base by looking at the fiscal impact, meaning it's great to bring in, a business or new residential to serve, but if we end up with a drain on our fiscal resources because of either, our tax rates are they're not lined up with the needs. One of the numbers we've seen a lot is when you look at residential versus commercial versus industrial, the cost to a community to provide services to each of those, it is, I think it's a 0.6 for every dollar of tax revenue. It only costs 0.6 for industrial. Commercial is a little bit higher, maybe 0.8. That's fire, that's police, that's all of the infrastructure. Versus residential, which is like a 1.7. So for every dollar that a residential community brings in tax revenue, it costs a community about $1.27 back, about 27 to provide those resources. So, as we're starting to look at land use and we're starting to think about how do we plan these communities, we're going to be looking at the fiscal impact, and economic development does that too. They run the fiscal impact analyses, not just tax revenue analyses. That second piece is bringing those quality jobs, really digging in and trying to figure out, are these the right jobs for the community? I mentioned career mobility. We look at things like, is there employee ownership potential? Is there benefits to in the jobs that are brought in? The economic development folks are asking these questions. It's not just enough to have 100 new jobs. If those jobs are 100 new jobs paying $8 an hour, would you rather have that? Or do you want to look for something that really benefits the community? And you're looking, especially if we're talking incentives, which Jeff will talk about very briefly, I think. And, we want to incentivize those better jobs, those higher paying jobs, because we start to see the impact in our communities when the wages are not livable. When it comes to housing, when it comes to a lot of the services and social needs that are required, all the way down to, our education system. So we're looking at improving in economic development, improving the standard of living of residents by attracting jobs with higher wages. Career mobility, asking for community benefits agreements for companies that come in, getting them to be better corporate citizens, really working with our existing businesses to help them grow and help them be stable in the community. So standard of living, that also includes, our parks and our other resources that create good quality of life. It's not just a financial standard of living, although that's important. And that economic development, you can see the direct link to planning, and we want to be as part of that. We're going to talk about target industries as well, but economic development has really evolved to not just, there's a famous saying that shoot anything that flies, claim anything that falls. So you just kind of do the shotgun approach, and whatever lands in your lap, economic developers will take credit for. We're trying really to create some targeted industries based on our demographics, based on our strengths, our assets, and doing some clustering creates that resiliency. It creates that, that strength in a particular economic sector. That's really important for planners to help with the demographics and the information and making sure that the land is available, that the educational resources are available, that we can create some of that with the infrastructure. So that's really exciting. And I know Steve's going to talk about target industries a little bit later because and it'll be interesting to know whether your communities have target industries or not. And if so, if you know what they are, again, we'll talk about that in a little bit, but those are some really great opportunities to help with even that standard of living, quality of life. Matching workforce training. Rob's going to talk about this, but really being able, economic development now says to industry, what do you need? What are the specific programs that you require, those skill sets? Career and college academies are popping up throughout communities as great partnerships or internships or apprenticeships to help create that pipeline for the labor force. And, so it's not just, just general, we do provide some basic workforce training, but the more we can connect with the industries, the better off we are. Housing, we all know as planners, housing is a major issue. Anybody here, anybody here, or really anybody, anywhere understands that affordability has become a thing of the past. We're looking at rising real estate rates. We're looking, how are we trying to, in economic development, if you're trying to recruit a business, help a business expand, you've got to provide them a labor force. The building's actually the easy part. It's having those operations up and ready. That's the difficult part. So having a local qualified workforce that can live in and around the community and reduce the impact on transportation networks and traffic and the expense of living farther away. There's a great resource, which is a housing and transportation index. I can certainly send out the link later on. You can kind of see how much somebody's income is spent toward both housing and transportation. So these are all things that we grapple with as planners, and economic development is starting to look into. Before, they kind of shied away from housing, but they're recognizing in order to bring these big companies in, they've got to have that housing resource. We're seeing that pinch. We've got phenomenal, big business attraction here in Georgia. 2,000 jobs, 500 jobs, and the housing market is feeling the pinch, so that's really important. Absolutely, small business and entrepreneurship. There's so many jobs, and I'll get the number wrong. It's 85–90% of all new jobs are associated with small business, and this is the real opportunity to create those. For economic development, to help support that entrepreneurship, to help support those small businesses, Christopher Pike is going to talk about small businesses and some of the resources that your community can use. And I want you to think about, how do I, as a planner, how do I help support that? You know, they may have an organization, a small business development center that can help support small businesses, but what can we be doing as planners? Land use and development and envisioning our redevelopment plans for corridors. How do we start to think about small business and entrepreneurship? What are some of those things that we can do? Finishing up, a couple more, addressing retail gaps and service gaps. We see so much, and I'll give an example. In Hapeville, we see so much emphasis on residential. And as somebody who, again, straddles that world, I keep saying, look, we cannot, you don't want to become a bedroom community. We have to keep pushing the commercial piece of this. And so otherwise, we got a lot of people living in a place where we cannot serve them in terms of their everyday retail or service needs, whether it's grocery store. We have plenty of food deserts as planners. We talk about that all the time, having those conversations with the economic developers and saying, hey, we need this in the community. Let's do a retail gap analysis, or let's sit down and figure out how we can attract not just your big players, your industrial, your commercial players, but how do we get some of the retail in here? How do we get on their radar in order to best serve the community? What are some of the programs we can do together? Tourism has emerged in economic development, really. I think more so historically, that those were lower wage jobs, but we're really seeing the impact on communities that can really embrace tourism and get all of those dollars in, whether it's through hotel motel tax or different kinds of opportunities to get folks to come and stay. Last one, and I think is really key, and there's so many more. I could go on for 3 hours. It's a 3.5 hour for everybody. So, and that is equitable access to infrastructure. And by that, I mean, yes, water and sewer and roads and transit and telecommunications, right? Broadband. So I think those are really important from a planning perspective about equity, about sustainability and resiliency, all of these different kinds of elements that are falling, frankly, a lot in the economic developers lab. We have an opportunity to coordinate. And the way in which we can coordinate is saying, all right, why does ED matter to planners? Thank you. And why does planning matter to economic developers? Things like land planning, infrastructure, resources, capital projects, community vision, making sure everybody's moving in the right direction, that they understand they can or cannot have a biotech facility in their community, affordable housing, accessible retail, workforce, and quality of life. So with that, hope I didn't go too fast. I'm just looking in the question and answer. Let's see. Question, how can the community best decide what economic development is and work with the robust ideas of the community? I would say, can you hang on to that question until the end? Because I think that that's going to be something that we're going to be pushing. It's individual for every community, and it's the conversations that you're having with economic development, making sure they're educated about the needs and the concerns that you have as planners, and likewise. So if we're good with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rob. And I'm sorry, I had my piece of paper out earlier with Rob's great bio, and I have misplaced it. So,
Lynn, that's fine.
I might ask you to give your own introduction. I'm so sorry. I'll find it for the others, I promise. But I would love to turn it over for you to talk about the benefits of economic development to communities.
All right, thank you, Lynn. Thank you, everybody, for being here. It looks like a great turnout. So a little bit about myself. My name is Rob LeBeau. I'm currently the manager of the Workforce Solutions Group at the Atlanta Regional Commission. And in that role, I serve as the director of the Atlanta Regional Workforce Development Board. Before taking on this role, which I did picked up about 7 years ago, I've spent a total about 21 years here at the Atlanta Regional Commission. I actually started my career at ARC managing the LCI program, the Livable Centers Initiative, and I ran that for about 12 years. And then I also ran I oversaw our comprehensive economic development strategy and our leadership programs of Link and RLI. And then before coming to ARC, I was actually a local government planner. I was down in Orlando, Florida, actually working for Orange County government. And there I worked in the zoning department. My very first job out of college was working the permit counter of a zoning department, and then moved into the planning department where I did a lot of work with comprehensive planning and neighborhood redevelopment plans and so forth. So spent about 10 years doing that. So hopefully I can share with you some experiences I've seen on the connection and the disconnection between workforce and economic development. I think Lynn provided a really great overview of the topics. And as she mentioned, I could probably go on for all 3 hours talking about this. So my comments really are going to be pretty high level. And I would be glad to answer any questions throughout this presentation. So let's see, it would not let me move the slope. There we go, slide. So you see on here, this is a definition of urban planning. Of course, there are many out there, but the key point here is that as planners, we focus on the physical environment of our communities, both the distribution of uses, looking at land use maps, looking at zoning maps, and also the physical appearance of those communities, looking at the buildings and the structures, the public amenities, the infrastructure, and so forth. So, we're looking at it from that standpoint. And then when you get to economic development, it was a great doodle poll that we saw earlier today that talks about wealth creation and creating jobs and creating goods and services, and basically the productivity and output of local firms and industry within your community. So quick question, you can go ahead and I guess we're just putting this in the chat box, not necessarily, well, I guess you could go ahead and use the word cloud. I don't know if that works, Molly or Andrew, but what do you see as key things that happens when there's a disconnect between planning and economic development? If you want to go ahead and add any of those to the chat box or that Google doodle poll.
Nick, could you clarify whether this is for the chat box or if there is a poll slide?
Everyone just drop your responses for this one into the chat. There's going to be a few other slides like this where just I ask you to drop, a brief thought in the chat, and you'll just use the chat that you all have been using throughout the presentation. All
right, good. So just, go ahead and drop them in the chat box and I'll hit on some of these. But when we're talking about the definition of the two, a couple of questions that come to mind that you'll want to think about as planners and economic developers. First off is, so how does the market-based framework of economic development align with or not align with a planner's physical view of the world? Another big thing to question is the time horizon. You think about economic development, those are usually looking for relatively short-term returns. What company can we recruit now to develop new jobs in the very short term? How do we expand the existing businesses to create more development and output in the very short term? We're talking, a few months, maybe up to a few years. In planning, of course, we're looking at very long-term timeframes. We'll do a plan that will be for 25 years and it has a 5-year implementation program. So the timeframes of the two often differ. I remember early on, in my career, when smart growth was first getting started, and you had Andres Duany was coming out with all of his smart growth plans, and there was a lot of pushback from the thoughts that he was espousing based on what the traditional planning was of the past. And I was at one conference when somebody got up and asked, so how do you deal with these people that are saying your plans are never going to work? You're wrong on this. If you met Andres, he's very blunt, and his comment was, I envisioned them dead. And he went on to say his point is the plans he's putting in place are not going to make an immediate impact, but 25, 50 years down the road, you're going to see the true benefits of changing the physical patterns of development. And the detractors will no longer be detractors because they'll no longer be around, and that you'll really see the impact of the plans that you put in place. So time frame is very different between planning and economic development. Another question that I've been thinking about, of course, recently is what is the impact of the pandemic on both of these fields? Are we going to see, we definitely saw some changes in the commuting pattern during the pandemic. They're starting to come back. But what's it going to look like particularly for those that work in an office? I know just at ARC, we have 3 floors of one of the office buildings in Peachtree Center. We have not been back in the office since March of 2020. We're looking at coming back in, but we also know that a lot of this is going to be working from home. And so what is going to be the impact on office space and on long-term commuting patterns? How does that affect the planning field as well as the economic development field? What's going to happen to all these spaces? Are they going to be repurposed? And then how do you deal with the impact of differing uses? You had all these offices and then you start bringing in new uses. Is it going to be compatible? Those are all things that we have to think about. And then the last comment I want to make on this relates to the people. When you look at the disciplines of economic development and planning, both of them have a very direct and very significant impact on the people who live, work, and play in the communities, the people who work in these jobs and produce that economic output. But oftentimes when we're doing these plans and we're creating them, we're not fully thinking about the actual people. We're thinking about the layout of the land uses and the orientation of the building. And sometimes we can forget about we're doing that because of the people. And how do we then fully integrate the people into the implementation of these? Planning has certainly done a much better job of bringing people into the planning aspects through public input sessions, but that wasn't always the case. But then once we get to implementation, is it good enough to say, we're going to build it and the people will come? And as we know, that doesn't always happen. There has to be assistance with the implementation. And I'll talk a little bit about that more as we talk to workforce, which was a big change for me in that in workforce, we're dealing with the individuals on a daily basis and helping to get them trained and helping to get them into jobs, which supports both, of course, planning and economic development. We'll go on to the next slide. All right, so a few things that come up when we talk about what happens when there is a disconnect between planning and economic development. And so I want to just touch on a couple of these. So first off, there's a spatial mismatch between land uses and needs. And this is really highlighted when you think about the development patterns that came out of the residential, particularly the residential development patterns that came out of 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. So you came out of the war. We had the veterans benefits of getting people into homes. You had the development of the interstate system, which of course was developed as a defense mechanism, so you can move troops and goods across the country quickly. But what that did is it opened up more land for development so that people then could move out of the traditional employment centers in town or your industrial areas, and you could then live further out away from those employment centers because you can get on the interstate and you could go to your suburban houses, your suburban development. Well, that, of course, and then of course with traditional Euclidean zoning created a separation of uses. All of that led to a mismatch between land uses and needs. We have these large expanses of single use development, these very large neighborhoods, suburban residential areas that were developed with no integration of employment, no integration of retail, and oftentimes no good recreational amenities. And of course, that started to change in the 80s and particularly in the 90s when you started talking about smart growth and going on from there about integrating those uses. But there was a lot of time spent of having a real disconnect between land uses and needs. And so then the economic developers would come in and say, all right, we need to bring in more industry. And then the industries would look at, well, where's my work base going to come from? How far away are they? If I have all my development in one area for employment and all my residents in another area, how are they going to get to the job? How big is my commuter shed? So what do we have to think about there? So there's definitely a spatial mismatch between land uses and needs. Something else that happens is that oftentimes you can have aspirational land use plans with no basis in reality. And we saw this with the early LCI plans. So we started LCI back in 2000. The first awards were done in 1999. The first plants started coming out of the ground in 2000, 2001. When I say coming out of the ground, they started being developed on paper. They weren't actually being built yet. But what we saw were so LCI at the time was focusing on town centers with some activity centers. So how do we redevelop these older downtowns that have seen a dearth of development lately, and a lot of vacant uses or vacant buildings? How do we redevelop these areas? And we saw some really fantastic plans, really looking at smart growth and looking at integrating uses, looking at bringing in more density. But the first few plans were just that. They were great looking plans on paper. And then we actually worked with some professors at Georgia Tech and others that came back and said, you've got to have some basis in reality. You have to have a market analysis that is done with your land use plan to show that all of this new retail that you've drawn on these pretty colors, how is that going to be supported? Where are the rooftops? Where are the people? Where are the money going to come from to support all of this retail? And then likewise, we saw all these plans for high density housing or different types of housing. Where's the market analysis says that type of housing will be supported in this community? And so the later plans, of course, had that connection. There's required to be a market analysis, but the earlier plans, and this still happens, of course, in many of our communities, there are these great looking plans with no basis in reality. And so you've got to bring in the economic development aspect of having the market realities of what can be supported in this area. How are you going to get the businesses here to fill all of this commercial and office space that you're putting on these maps? And we also see this quite often when you're looking at corridor redevelopment plans, is that you'll start bringing in more high density nodes for commercial retail. But then what happens to all that strip retail that is heading down that commercial corridor? You're just going to be basically stealing from your retail base further down the road and creating all these vacant old commercial properties if you don't have a true market analysis set with that. One other example on this, some of the early comprehensive plans that I worked on, and then that I remember reviewing, particularly when I was at ARC, was you look at a community's plan of what they see the amount of growth they're going to have in residential development or commercial development when they look at your population and employment projections. But I was seeing a disconnect between those projections and what they were showing on their land use plan. So if you say you're going to grow by, 10,000 people in the next 10 years, but you have very little vacant land available and you're still not allowing high density residential, your low density residential only says you're going to support 2,000 more people. Well, there's a clear disconnect between economic development and the realities of the market and what you're showing on your land use plans. So another conflict that we will often see between disconnect with planning and economic development relates to negative externalities resulting from adjacent economic uses. And we see this a lot, for example, in our industrial areas. We have industrial development that's coming in and they might be wanting to expand in a certain area, but they've been hemmed in by residential neighborhoods. But you have the industrial areas that say, we really have a need for transportation, distribution, logistics. We need to bring in more trucks to support these TDL uses. And you're starting to see a conflict between all these heavy truck use and the neighboring communities. So you have to think about those negative externalities of those uses as well. And the last thing I want to talk about just quickly is diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the disparities that we can see throughout the region. And one of the really significant things that we have in the Atlanta region relates to housing, economic mobility. So of the 25 biggest metro areas in the United States, Atlanta is last in economic mobility. And what I mean by that is when you look at the incomes of children from low income parents, what is the likelihood of those children moving up to higher income areas within the Atlanta region? And in Atlanta, children born to low income parents have the least likely opportunity to move to a higher income cohort compared to the other 25 biggest regions. And so that is a significant issue that we all need to work on from planning. It affects planning, economic development, workforce development, education. It really crosses so many different disciplines that we have to look at of how do we improve economic mobility in Metro Atlanta. Another issue that we have with when we talk about equity is the spatial differences in life expectancy in Metro Atlanta. It really is shocking when you look at neighborhoods based on zip code that are 10 miles apart, that we have a 10-year difference in life expectancy because of where you are born and where you live. There's significant impacts. And so we really need to think about how do we, as our economic development and planning disciplines, support these disparities that we're seeing in the Atlanta region. All right, we'll move on to the next slide. I want to talk just a little bit about workforce development because this is where I have been focusing my time over the last 7 years, and it was an interesting change for me. So when we talk about workforce development, we are talking about an interconnected set of solutions to meet local employment needs. There are numerous workforce development organizations in Metro Atlanta, and together we are trying to deliver comprehensive workforce solutions to our two primary customers. And those are job seekers, whether you're unemployed or underemployed, and businesses or employers. So those are our two primary customers, and we're creating a set of solutions to work with both of them. And they're linked, but they are different. And for example, with job seekers, we offer through the U.S. Department of Labor, we get these funds that come in, and we offer training and retraining programs for our job seekers. And people can come to us if they qualify at no cost to them, and we can spend up to $7,000 of training in a year or up to $10,000 for a 2-year program. And we can get them certified in in-demand careers within the community. And so obviously there's a real connection with workforce development or with economic development and planning when we start talking about workforce development. So what's interesting though is in the past, even at the federal level, workforce and economic development were intentionally separated at the federal level. The previous federal law, the Workforce Innovation Act, prohibited the use of workforce funds for economic development activities. That was the Workforce Investment Act. And then under the new law, the WIOA, Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, which was adopted in 2014, there were 3 pillars of the WIOA federal law. One of them was supporting that workforce development supports a regional economic development activities. And so we saw a shift in 2015 of really tying in workforce development and economic development more closely. And you actually see that in our physical orientation of our disciplines now. And you'll hear from Samir right after this with Fulton Economic Development. In Fulton County, workforce development now comes under the Development Authority. So there needs to be that really close tie between workforce development and economic development and planning. Lynn mentioned targeted industries. As planners, we will zone an area for certain broad uses, and we may not necessarily target them into specific industries, but we should be working more closely with our economic development folks and our workforce staff to look at targeted industries, because as Lynn mentioned, now under the federal workforce law, every local workforce board has to identify targeted industries. In Metro Atlanta, there are 5 workforce boards. We are considered one workforce region, and because we're considered one workforce region, we also have to identify and agree on what are the targeted industries for the region. So in Metro Atlanta, there are 5 targeted industries. That includes IT, healthcare, transportation, distribution, logistics, advanced manufacturing, and skilled trades. So as planners, if you don't know those, you really should. And as you're working on development plans, those are the industries that we really hope that you're going to be focusing on with your economic development folks and your workforce folks in your community. All right, so we'll move on. I think there's a poll now. Let's see here. Yeah, so what do you see as the most pressing concern in your community about workforce development? And Andrew or Molly, is this Oh, all right, there we go. I believe everybody can just enter an answer.
And again, this is through the Poll Everywhere poll. So this is similar to the very first poll, not the last one, which was in the chat box. So don't enter ideas in the chat box, but use those instructions at the very top to join the poll if you haven't already. This is something you can do via texting on your phone or just opening a new tab or a new window in a web browser.
All right, and as you continue to enter your answers, I do see a question repeating the 5 targeted industries. Yes, they are IT, so information technology, healthcare, transportation, distribution, logistics, TDL, advanced manufacturing, and skilled trades. So construction and welding, plumbing, electrical, that type of work. So those are the 5 targeted industries in Metro Atlanta. And so each of your 5 local workforce development boards may have some additional targeted industries, but collectively we have come together and said those are the 5 targeted industries for the 10 county Metro Atlanta area. So yes, good responses on some of the pressing issues related to workforce development. And as you can see, this also crosses disciplines when we start talking about transportation and affordable housing, which are 2 of the biggest ones that are showing up as answers. And then I'm going to end on one last slide as an example of an issue that we look at and how it really does cross multiple disciplines. And so this is a slide that looks at the commuting patterns of the 10 counties in Metro Atlanta and the percentage of people who reside in a county that commute for a job outside of their home county. Now, this was pre-pandemic, and we do anticipate that this is going to shift a little bit, but I think it really tells a story. When you look at, of the 10 counties in Metro Atlanta, 7 of them show that 70% of the people who live in a county commute outside of that county for their job. Only 1 county, that's Fulton County, has a majority of people that remain within their home county for employment. And when you think about it, it makes sense. Fulton County includes the city of Atlanta, and the primary employment centers are downtown, Midtown, Buckhead, and part of Perimeter Center. So when you think about that, there are a lot of planning and economic development considerations that come to mind. For example, is there a lack of adequate employment in these other counties? For example, Douglas County, which is at 81%, and Rockdale County at 81% of the people actually leave the county for employment. Is there a lack of employment in those areas? Probably, and variety of employment. And then on the other hand, is there a lack of housing and housing types and housing prices in our major employment areas? Would more people be living in our activity centers in our downtown areas if there was more housing? Probably. How much of this is because people are choosing to live further from their jobs? Or is it by necessity? It's a combination of both, I'm sure. But there are some people who would always choose to live further away from their job. They want to work in an urban environment. They want to live in a more rural environment. I'm thinking of Miss Allison Duncan, one of my favorite colleagues from ARC, who I believe is on here, who wanted to live in a more rural environment after living in Virginia Highlands for a long time. Allison, good to see you. Other things that come up is what type of, from an economic development standpoint, if you're putting in a new major employer in one of these counties, say Rockdale County, where most people commute out, are you going to have a labor shed that's going to support these big developments? How are they going to get there? What is the likelihood of people being able to drive to that employment center in a reliable amount of time to support the needs of that new employer? So there's a lot of different things that you can think about when you just look at a slide like this as it relates to both planning and economic development. And I see that I am at 5 minutes left, and I would be glad to pause right there and answer any questions that you may have. And I will put a plug out for workforce development. Like I said, I could do a full session on workforce development and talk here for hours. I do encourage you to find out more about workforce development in your community. A site that I would encourage everybody to look at is atlworks.org, and I will put that in the chat box. It's atlworks.org. That is a common landing page that the 5 workforce boards have put together for all customers within the 10-county workforce area. And it provides a good overview of the basic services that are provided to both our employers and our job seekers. There's a page on there where you could put in your home address and it will tell you which workforce board you should be working with. And there are some testimonial pages on there about some of the services that customers that we worked with. So I encourage you to look at atlworks.org. You can also look at the ARC website and go into workforce development, and you can see our local and regional workforce plans, get more information about the targeted industries, and particularly there are half the document is geared towards, of the 80-page local workforce plan is geared towards data, and you can see why we chose the 5 targeted industries that we did. One of the really positive things about the 5 industries we chose is that they really showed to be pretty resilient through the pandemic, is that there were some job losses in those industries, but nowhere near as significant as other areas such as hospitality. And they are coming back pretty strongly. So I encourage you to take a look at those workforce plans, a local workforce plan and a regional workforce plan on the ARC website under workforce development. And I see that my time is about up, got about 2 more minutes. If there are any more questions, I'd be glad to answer them now. If not, Lynn, I'll be glad to pass them off to you. I don't know if you have any questions or if you just want to move on to our next panelist, which is going to be Samir with Fulton Economic Development.
Thanks, Rob. That was great. And I think we had a couple in the Q&A questions, maybe just to think about. One was, how do we incentivize the repurposing of existing office buildings? You know, thinking about that disconnect between planning and economic development. Is that something that we want to do? You don't have to answer these. I'm just kind of putting them out there since we only have a minute. The other is, how do you learn about improving economic mobility? Maybe that's out of workforce training. Then another one was, you know, is the fix to develop jobs specifically for those who live in that respective county, to free up a county for someone who free up a job in the county for someone who lives in that county. Maybe that one is closely, I'll let you sort of pick one of those, and if you want to take a minute to respond.
Oh, sorry, Lynn, I was actually, repeat that last question. I was typing a response to one of the written questions. So.
That's okay. I think the question is, you know, maybe just because there's a disconnect question in the workforce question. And one of those is one of the fixes to develop jobs specifically for those who live in that respective county. You know, we live in a metro Atlanta, people are fluid between counties, but does that, by creating those jobs in the county that more closely align with the needs of the community or the availability assets of the community, is that a fix?
Yeah, you know, it potentially could be a fix, but what you really need to work at is what are the skills within certain areas, and then how do you increase the skills of those people there? For example, if you look at high schools and you look at their CTAE programs, their career technical education, there's some great programs to get high school students skills as they graduate high school and to start work immediately. But oftentimes those CTAE programs are not aligned to the specific industries in that community. They come from the state level. What are the skills we're looking at state level? Well, agriculture isn't really going to be much of a draw in Clayton County, but which might be being taught in that high school, but there might be something else, such as logistics would be a great program in Clayton County with the airport. So I think there's an opportunity really to align your training programs to reflect the needs of the existing businesses in local communities. I think I would highlight that as one of the key fixes for that.
Yeah, that's great. And I think the key is realizing that every place is local, right? Realizing that the characteristics are different. And I know Steve is going to touch upon this, and we'll probably hear it again about the targeted industries and how, you know, those need to fit your community. We have statewide targeted industries, but even your community needs to take a really good look at what its assets are to evaluate those. You know, there's a community I work with that doesn't have a rail line. don't try to get stuff that needs a rail line. If you
Right.
don't have a rail line, it's not going to be, you're on the wrong end of the numbers on that one. So, okay, well, Rob, thank you. If you want to take a minute before you sign off, I know you're, and I so appreciate your time today. There's maybe some questions in the chat if you want to answer now or later. And just so I think I saw a question as I move to our next one. You will be getting a link to the recording as well as the slides. And so if you've got questions, throw them in the Q&A, and you never know, you might get a direct answer. So, all right, thank you so much. So we'll move on. Samir Abdullahi is our next speaker. Samir is the Deputy Director of Select Fulton, the Economic and Workforce Development Initiative for Fulton County Government. He has 10 years of experience in the Metro Atlanta market. He has previously worked for the City of Alpharetta and Partnership Gwinnett. He has assisted with major relocations and expansions, including Fiserv, Halyard Health, ASOS, and most recently Microsoft. So Samir's going to talk to us about business retention and expansion as a key component of economic development. And maybe touch a little bit on recruitment. We'll do more of that later on, but we're looking forward to hearing what he has to say and what the role for planner is. So thanks.
Thank you, Lynn. Sorry, I'm just getting the controls here working just briefly. Let it go in here a second. Okay, great. So good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Samir Abdullahi, Deputy Director for Select Fulton. Part of my bio should have been, I'm an elder millennial. I have a house, I have 2 kids, I have a car, so don't fit us all in one box. I always like to promote that on the road. And a big shout out to Rob LeBeau and highlighting kind of what Select Fulton is, especially on the workforce development piece of things. When we took that over back in 2018, him and the ARC were a great help in really steering us in the right direction and turning the grant around from where it was. And we've really taken it off into being a leader in the Metro Atlanta region. So briefly, I just wanted to highlight Select Fulton. It was alluded to earlier. I think we're just a really unique economic development organization in a way that we've kind of glued 3 separate entities together to kind of provide seamless economic and workforce development services here in Fulton County. So we are the Development Authority of Fulton County, which is really our main real estate and incentive arm. They work with large CapEx developers and companies, typically over $10 million, to bring new investments or to spur investments, to get them off the ground, typically working with developers to get a building going spec. You know, business leaders and investors, they have to see it to believe it. And if we can get that building out of the ground today, instead of delivering it in 18 months, that's usually a big value add in recruiting companies and building development. Kind of our middle economic development team there under Fulton County, we work on not only supporting projects with the state, the Metro Atlanta Chamber, the 15 cities that make up Fulton County, and then partnering with the 10 county Metro Atlanta region to bring companies here, but also market and promote Fulton County as a great place to do trade and commerce. And then lastly, we stand on WorkSource Fulton, which is what Rob alluded to, our federal WIOA grant to provide upskilling for either unemployed or underemployed individuals to see those kind of better socioeconomic outcomes and help to try to build some of these talent pipelines and fill some of these skills gaps that we see continue to be an issue. And I think you'll hear from the other economic development professionals today that workforce development continues to be a larger piece of what we're dealing with, especially from Fortune 500 headquarters all the way to, fulfillment centers, technology and having kind of a knowledge-based economy, having individuals that are skilled for those positions has always been a big challenge and an increasing challenge that we see. So when we think about recruitment and retention, and this is a little bit of a traditional way of thinking about economic development, I always try to think of these 3 legs of, while we do want to encourage and support jobs, there's kind of a focus around high wage and high skill jobs just based on resources. There can be a lot of great spillover effects from creating and supporting an IT job that can support 1.2, or there's always that multiplier effect, 1.3 retail jobs or service industry jobs. So trying to, again, be mindful and strategic in the types of jobs that you recruit and make sure that they fit the community that currently exists in the economic atmosphere that's in your community is always important. The other thing we always think about is kind of increasing and sustaining the capital investment in the community. Again, that financial basis for how we're able to provide the services, which ultimately leads into that last piece, which is fiscal security. So I always tell my commissioners, my elected officials, my businesses don't get to vote, yet they're 50, 40, 30% of our revenue stream. And like Lynn was alluding to, they put more into the system than they take out. And so they can really be that fiscal security blanket necessary to provide all the other services that we're providing to residents out there. So those kind of two pieces work up to ultimately, why do we do economic development? Why we do this recruitment and retention piece is that fiscal security. Recruitment and retention, while they are different, we'll talk about those differences, there's a lot of overlap and similarities in how the approaches go and also the goals there. So when we think about the goals, it's always going to be the creation of new jobs, and that can be the import of jobs from other communities, or again, growing those jobs there locally and supporting that. And we'll talk about that. Increasing the local tax base, again, importing new investment to the community, but also fostering a community that can grow the tax base internally, supporting existing companies so they can grow and expand. Enhancing your community brand. When a company comes in to your marketplace, it's a great story. It's something that you can sell and say, look, we're still active. There's still investment happening here. But also similarly with companies that are already there, we've created an atmosphere and a platform for the companies that we love and support to grow here locally. They didn't have to go somewhere else to kind of hit that next phase of their business plan. And then lastly, thinking about a sustainable economic activity. Again, demonstrating to not only the companies that are inside of your community, but companies that are interested in either moving to your community or growing inside of your community, that you've got future opportunities for growth. And that can be in all different iterations, whether from a workforce development standpoint, additional quality of life amenities, and additional development opportunities. And then again, the approaches can be very similar in the way that we activate on them. And I'll go over these quickly. Again, marketing and branding and promoting yourself is a great place to do trade and commerce. Helping with that site selection piece, which is always so critical. You can be a great community, but if you don't have the real estate to support those companies, you're not going to grow in that way. Incentives are important, but like I said, there are other push and pull factors that help to drive community or companies and their decisions. You could offer all the money in the world. If they don't have the real estate they need, if they don't have the access to the workforce pipeline or the talent pipeline that they need, they're not going to locate in your community. And similarly about B2B connections and community connections, about supporting that ecosystem for companies as they come in. Where can they plug into, or if they're already in your community, where can they grow into? And we'll go into all of these in a lot more detail. One of the first things I wanted to do as a poll is on the retention side of things. So companies that are inside of your community, what % of new jobs actually come from companies that are expanding internally? We'll open this up to the poll. Thanks. And this may not be a hard and fast number. Kind of probably goes back and forth, but we'll see what the group offers up.
Come on, folks, you can do it. Give it a guess. I'm not seeing anything yet.
Yeah, I don't see it.
Hopefully it's working.
Hover in kind of the top right area of the screen, Samir, and there should be a button that appears that says show responses. You can see it right with the eye. There you go.
Aha. See how these come in. I'm so glad I asked.
That is a setting that's sometimes built into the slide, but sometimes not.
No problem. Well, I'm really glad I asked this question then. Really heavy in that 14 to 42% range. Hopefully nobody calls me out on what that stat's going to be. We'll pull it back, sorry. In the field, 75, 80% of your new jobs are going to come from existing businesses. And I think that's usually surprising for people. While you may see in the headlines a lot of great corporate announcements, the ribbon cuttings and the like, most of your jobs are going to come from just like when you think about large versus small enterprise, most of your jobs are held in the small business format. And they're creating 1 to 2 jobs that, again, are not making the headlines, aren't creating big press. And that's why we always try to make sure we focus on that retention piece. Again, recruitment is kind of glitz and glamour, but making sure you're supporting your existing companies so that they can grow locally, that's where a lot of your job creation is going to come from. And so when we think about retention, again, how are we going to keep that business inside of our community? And then more importantly, how are we creating an atmosphere for that company to grow inside of our community? Versus recruitment, a little bit different kind of focal point, a little bit more on the marketing and promoting side of things. You're trying to tell your story. Think about Austin weird, Charlotte banking, Nashville music. I'd be interested to know if anyone thought of Atlanta. Does it have a singular brand? Maybe it is around civil rights. Maybe it's around college sports and the like. And then similarly, how we positioned our community for more business investment. As I mentioned, do you have the real estate? Have you carved out the real estate for those targeted industries like Rob mentioned before to grow there? Do you have that workforce and talent pipeline for them to grow? Is your community accessible for the customers and clients that they need to be able to access? Atlanta having the Hartsfield-Jackson Airport is just a major economic driver and why we see such a great Fortune 500 recruitment and positioning here in the Metro Atlanta region. So diving down a little bit more deeply when we think about recruitment and attraction, as I mentioned before, kind of those core services around marketing and promoting, really branding yourselves, how you're telling your story, and that can be through either ads or going to meet the customers where they are at industry trade shows, site selection events, other professional kind of service and association events to go and tell your story. Ideas around site selection. Here's the great real estate opportunities and amenities that we have inside of our community. Here's the incentives that we try to drive towards companies because it drives towards the goals that we've created internally. What is some of that more granular community data that's not available in some of these big data tools that site selectors and other commercial real estate professionals have? What's something kind of unique that the data doesn't necessarily speak to? And again, the value add for these can be through marketing and promotion, really reflecting a dynamic, a relevant, growing community. I mean, perception matters for decision makers. While the nuts and bolts are important, but perception matters as well. Again, I mentioned Austin. They've really done a good job in capitalizing on something like that. And then again, new investment into your community just adds to the economic mix of the existing community. Show that you're still vibrant, that you are still dynamic as a community. So again, this is kind of how some of this translates out. We try to tell our story that Fulton County is, and we do that through our marketing materials, through website promotions, through strategic ads in industry publications, business publications, both locally and outbound, to really help people get positioned on, I think Fulton County is. We've really positioned Fulton County as Metro Atlanta starts here. People don't know county governments, they know metro markets. And so if I can get them focused on Metro Atlanta, there's an 80-90% chance I can get them landed here in Fulton County. And that's kind of the strategy we've taken here at Fulton County. As I mentioned, that site selection piece, a lot of us offer kind of commercial real estate site selection tools on our websites, again, trying to push investors and companies towards specific properties and sites that can be in the form of some top sites. And those may have just been properties that have just come on the market. A lot of the times there's a lot of questions around unlisted opportunities. I get questioned all the time about properties that the county owns to get kind of below market rate opportunities for real estate development. But again, being that internal individual with insight around your community and in partnership with your planning professionals to offer that something that the data doesn't readily kind of provide to that site selector or company executive. When I think about incentives, I always think about, it's like the Freakonomics books, incentives matter. Like, what are we incentivized on at the local level? We get our money through ad valorem taxes, through property taxes on the personal and real property side of things, versus the state of Georgia. They get most of their income through job income taxes. And so the state is motivated by jobs. On the community level, we're much more motivated and can drive incentives towards the capital investment side of the picture. Always think about your incentives around what is the return on investment. Don't offer up the farm if you're not going to get, the metropolis or a big building on the back end of it. And then a lot of times incentives can be about filling a market gap as you get a little more rural, away from the urban areas. The incentives just have to be much more attractive. It has to be free land. There has to be utilities to the site. They may not pay property taxes for a long proportion of the time of the project period. Because again, you're trying to fill that market gap of getting real interest and attraction and new development happening in your community. So that can help drive what those incentives are going to be. Similarly, like what I mentioned about community data, again, a lot of companies are much more sophisticated in the way that they approach their relocation decision-making. And they have a lot of the same tools through ESRI and the Census Bureau and the like that we have around demographics, workforce development. I think some of the things that we can really add, again, is more of that granular, insightful information that doesn't come up in those data tools around what's this new mixed use development that's a really great quality of life amenity that is attractive, that again may not come up in the broader data sets. Similarly, what are new infrastructure initiatives that are going on? Is T-SPLOST funding not only roadway improvements, but is it enhancing transit improvements? Is it impacting the area that we were considering for either relocating our company? So being able to offer a little bit more conversational, granular information can be wildly helpful for companies trying to relocate into your community. When we think about retention and expansion, again, a little bit different. There's a lot more focus around supporting companies and talking to companies that are already there. So a little less on the market and promote how great things are, but better understanding what are the needs and challenges of those companies that are inside of your community. And that can be through relationship building, again, understanding what are those needs and challenges, and we'll talk about that in detail. How do you support industry ecosystems? So that's convening partners, convening industries to understand what are those push and pull factors for their success, whether they need to leave your community or how they can grow inside of your community. And then again, back to workforce development. How are you helping to build those talent pipelines so that if they wanted to grow there locally, they can do that? As I mentioned before, around 80 or 70% of your new job creation is going to come from your existing businesses. So it's much more cost effective to support your existing companies to make sure that they can grow and expand. Although it may not require as much of a individual hands-on approach as something like recruitment. And then similarly, sustaining the tax base needed to do the recruitment piece. It's hard to pitch a company that wants to come inbound, how great it is in your community if they see companies internally having to move out because they aren't able to kind of grow that business into that next phase. So it's really essential and important to make sure you're taking care of those existing companies as part of that hook to bring in new companies and investment. So what does that relationship building look like? We use this term existing industry visits or EIVs. I know my time at Partnership Gwinnett, we had to do about 50 of these per industry segment. Annually, we did some of this kind of surveying with our North Fulton businesses during the COVID pandemic. We kind of did a monthly time series of surveys to really understand how companies were challenged during the pandemic, whether it was access to workforce development and individuals, they're scared about coming back into work, or actually just their ability to be open based on kind of government regulations there. Being able to have those open lines of communication is just really critical in understanding what are those boots on the ground needs and challenges. Another thing around relationship building can be community recognition. In Alpharetta, we had an Alpharetta Business Awards program. Very simple breakfast. Anyone who won, any company in Alpharetta that won a kind of an award or recognition in the past year, we gave them an Alpharetta award. They got to come meet the mayor, get a little speech by them, making them feel like they were a part of the community, not just a building kind of off the main interstate inside of our community, but making them feel kind of co-invested in the brand and identity of our community. And then they can act as kind of echo chambers as they're on the golf course or at their industry trade shows talking about, yeah, you know, I'm in this community, it's great, we can grow there, they're supportive, you should come be a part of what they're about. And so those kinds of things could really open up opportunities for growing business. I mentioned supporting ecosystem. I think this is one that continues to be more and more important around, and there's different versions of this. In Alpharetta, we had an industry council that we originally created as the Alpharetta Technology Commission, which then evolved into Tech Alpharetta. You can see here, we took an old finance building, just repurposed it and named it an innovation center, put some nice new paintings on the wall, and really was just creating that real estate for conversation to happen. One of the things we heard was, we've got a great technology base here in Alpharetta, but we have to go to downtown Atlanta in order to participate in that ecosystem. Is there an opportunity to create that locally? And that's what we did. Similar with Main Street and downtown programs, how are you coalescing those entities together to have kind of a singular focus, a singular brand? And that can be either around events, how they promote themselves, shopper reward programs, and the like. Another thing we did at Partnership Gwinnett, we had things called Supplier Days. So we invited companies that both access the supply chain, but also were a part of the supply chain business to come and meet and greet with one another to say, I go out to Ohio to get pipes and electrical wiring, but there's actually a company here locally that can do it. And so instead of having to wait 3 weeks for that to ship, I can build that local relationship and get it here locally. So really breaking down some of those barriers of companies feeling a little isolated and siloed away. There's opportunities to kind of break some of those down. Again, Rob mentioned a lot about workforce development and that being a bigger piece. That's been a big value add for us on the economic development side of things. I know Christopher Pike from the city of South Fulton will speak later, and they've just annexed parts of Fulton Industrial Boulevard there on the west side of Atlanta. One of the big challenges we see over there from a skills gap analysis is industrial mechanics. There's a lot of manufacturing facilities like Coca-Cola and Pepsi and the like on the west side there. And one of their biggest challenges is around industrial mechanics. Does that limit their ability to grow that business platform there on the west side? Do they have to relocate to another community that's got a stronger profile in those types of talent pipelines that they need? And leveraging those workforce development programs to help build those talent pipelines, getting in early. STEM is such a great example of that you have to get in that kind of elementary, middle school to build those talent pipelines. It's not as if you can just kind of turn those things on overnight. So being close in to understand what those skills gaps are and then react to them is important. A great way to do that can be through industry immersion programs. Again, leveraging those targeted industries that you already have a focus around, engaging the companies in those targeted industries to do a video series or to bring students on site to really socialize those local job opportunities and breaking down the perception of what it means to be in the TDL trade or the like. And so some of those, again, those can be some of those efforts that really enhance and support companies that want to grow here locally. And so really wrapping up, to me, some of the big takeaways when you're doing recruitment and retention is about being proactive. You cannot be reactive to these types of things. If a company wants to know kind of what is your brand or what are you doing related to infrastructure from a transit perspective, being able to talk about we've done T-Splosh and we're investing in these types of transit projects as opposed to we're thinking about doing these different initiatives. So being really proactive in those engagements demonstrates that you've got focused around supporting companies and helping them to grow. Economic development, and especially on the recruitment and retention side of things, is definitely a team sport. It's involving definitely your different community partners, those inside and outside of your lane. So it doesn't just mean I work with economic development professionals. I work with planning professionals, community organizations, workforce development entities, commercial real estate houses, broader regional economic development, EDOs. Kind of going in this business alone, it can be really challenging and isolating. And then I think another big point of that is defining success. If you're, again, a little bit more rural part of Georgia, saying that, like everyone else, we want to recruit Fortune 5 headquarters, that may be out of your scope of reality. And so defining what does success actually look like and making sure it's measurable and something that is attainable is really helpful in providing that future success for your economic development efforts. And it looks like I've got 5 minutes left. I know I went through that very quickly, but it gives a very kind of broad brush strokes of what recruitment looks like and retention, how there's a lot of overlap in some of those goals and efforts, but how we kind of distinguish them out and how granular I think you can get with each of those initiatives. And again, that's going to be based on how you define your success, what your community is, where it is in that kind of economic development timeline, and where you and your elected officials really want to head towards. So, and again, if you want to throw any questions in the chat, I'm happy to answer those real quick.
Samir, if I can just sort of get us started, we do have just a couple minutes, about 4 minutes left just to stay on schedule. So thank you. I think you made some really good points. One is sort of in the preparation stage when you're looking at site selectors or you're putting together your online inventories, making sure, or even when people inquire, planners often kind of know what's going on the ground sometimes because they're hearing things about potential land use. So that's a great opportunity for planners to be directly involved. Ambassadors, I cannot express how important it is. As a former site selector, we would go in and listen just quietly, nobody knew who we were, to understand what is it like to do development here. So when you have existing companies and they feel neglected, right, that actually can make its way into the dialogue with new businesses, or people just get frustrated. I think so business retention and expansion efforts are really, really important. And maybe even there may be some questions, or maybe I just put it in the chat. How do you see your role as a planner, not Samir, but the rest of you, how do you see yourself inserting into some of the retention and expansion activities? How can you support that effort, and or how can they be supporting you? Was that too wordy? Throw in a couple of thoughts about in the chat about how you as a planner can support business expansion and retention, infrastructure needs, right? Making sure that we're looking at that. When you do your BRE visits, are you reporting back to planners to talk about, hey, they need an extra lane here, or they need a lot? I mean, I'm just using transportation examples. There's a million others.
I think they're excited for that break, maybe.
Okay.
No, I agree. I mean, working close with kind of your local planner, while it can be combative at times, right? Because economic development, we're really providing that bigger funnel is the way I like to think about it, is we're trying to seize upon broad opportunities. While there's definitely a strategic focus to the work, somewhat agnostic to the more nitty-gritty details of the type of development and the like. And that's what we look to planners to do, is to really be that protector of the overall community and make sure that they provide the standards for development so that the community grows in kind of a unified, but more importantly, a sustainable way. And much more for us is about cheerleading that company, promoting the community, talking things up. To get them focused and kind of locked into your community. And then again, somewhat of a handoff to that community planner to make sure now you're kind of meeting the ultimate merits and the standards that we have as a community for you to kind of come in to locate. But, again, if you're wining and dining anyone on the front end, it's just really important to kind of upsell them, to show a really welcoming and open an encouraging environment on the front end, and get them really enticed into your community, and then work with those planning professionals to kind of set expectations and kind of, we call that ombudsman service of really walking them through the process. What I love about this field is besides the fact it's just multidisciplinary, we're translators, right? We speak both public and private. And a lot of the times those two entities don't speak the same language. And I think as economic development professionals, we're kind of able to translate what are those needs and challenges from a business perspective, but also from a community perspective, to get both parties to understand, here's how we're going to find a way to meet in the middle so we can both be successful. That's what I enjoy about the business.
Hey,
Great.
Andrew Smith, I wonder if you could speak to, I think it kind of connects to a couple threads in the chat. I know we have a lot of economic development professionals, a lot of planning professionals in the session today, but I think we also have some grassroots and neighborhood community organization representatives today. And there are a couple of questions that have to do with even the very first one that Lynn already mentioned about, how can the community kind of best decide what economic development looks like for them? And then the most recent question at the bottom of the Q&A which was how do you think citizens and grassroots community organizations can collaborate with their city or county governments to support economic development? I think it could also extend to how do they connect directly to economic development professionals as well. There's multiple languages. There's private sector planners, ED folks, and then community grassroots folks as well. So is there proper route to just go through their traditional planning channels and talk to their local planners and elected officials, or are there connections directly to the economic development community?
Yeah, I mean, obviously going to the elected official is going to get anyone to stand up and pay attention. That's a great way to kind of start. But, you know, economic development, there's layers to it, right? There's the state, the Metro Atlanta Chamber, there's counties, there's cities, and then internally, I mean, while they're not branded economic development, we've got community improvement districts and the like. That, again, the closer in you're able to kind of plug into that local economic development professional, being able to share what those needs and challenges for the community are. I mean, while we are pro-development, there's no point in kind of driving development into a community that it won't be successful or welcomed or really fit the existing community there. So I think it's kind of part of that existing industry kind of platform and that existing industry visit, being a part of those conversations, either plugging in through those ecosystem type of programs that are put on. So either those industry councils and being able to participate on that, or just being able to call upon your local economic development professional, and being able to be organized and presenting what are the goals of that grassroots organization to your elected officials. Obviously, economic development professionals would take that very seriously and understanding, because that's a lot of what drives where we go. Economic development is somewhat of it's a nebulous term. It's kind of like sustainability. It's hard to really define exactly what specifically economic development can mean. So it's, again, really doing that engagement on a local level, defining and organizing yourself of what you will accept and what you won't accept, connecting with those elected officials and making sure that's being communicated down to that local economic development professional, but also that local planner too, who's establishing the kind of the groundwork for where development will happen.
Great. Thanks. Great insight. I think that's probably going to come up a number of times over and over again, is how are we getting involved? It's not just the municipal planners, but it is the grassroots. There are so many organizations, to your point about sort of the ambassadors for economic development. There are so many different opportunities with different partners. So thank you very much. I want to be true to time. We're a couple minutes over, but I want to give everybody a break. So we will take our 15-minute break, 12 minutes, 13 minutes, and then we'll come back and carry back on at 10:45 with Jeff talking about economic development tools. Okay, so thank you. We'll see you in a few. Well, hello, everybody. All right. It's always interesting on a webinar to see if anybody's actually back with us. It's 10:45. I'm a little concerned about the chat. So here's what I'm going to ask. If you are here, there you go. Thank you, Chris. All right, that's great. I've got some folks popping in and putting present or hello, just a couple. Awesome. Or you can raise your hand just really briefly, just to make sure everybody's back. If you have any questions, please let us know. If we're obviously trying to be as interactive as we can in this medium. Hopefully, yeah, I know the here hi. That will be kind of funny, won't it? I don't know if anybody has raised their hand. I can't see that, but just to say you're back. All righty. Great. Okay, just to make sure that it was working, I don't know, maybe everybody took off early. Samir did a great job talking about our business retention and expansion efforts, and I look forward to more conversations about it. Even we have some time at the end, we're going to do some Q&A for both Kevin Johns, and if you have some questions, if our folks are still online, we didn't want to ask them to spend all day with us. They have to go out and do all that great modern holistic economic development that they need to do their job. So we'll do the best we can. I am going to go ahead and get us started, maybe, with Jeff Kosky. And Jeff is, hi Jeff, is Bleakley Advisory Group's president and leader of the 9-person real estate and economic development consulting firm. He has 15 years of experience in researching and analyzing reporting on real estate. So he's our real estate go-to guy. I know I've had conversations with him over time about properties. He joined Bleakley Advisory Group in 2012, bringing an extensive experience in assessing market and financial potential of various real estate product types and mixed-use development. It is now KB Advisory Group. I think that happened a couple of months ago, right? So anyway, we're excited. He's going to spend some time, and I'm going to get out of the way so he can talk to you about some economic development tools, not just incentives, but overall tools to help implement the visions that the planning community has developed over time, as well as the ED folks. So with that, I'm going to let you go ahead. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you very much. Really appreciate your leadership on this. You did an amazing job getting this all together, Lynn. So thank you, and thank you to ARC for getting this together. As Lynn said, I am Jeff Kosky, president of KB Advisory Group. We were Bleakley Advisory Group just a few months ago, changed our name. Same people doing the same things. And what we do, as Lynn said, is a lot of real estate market analysis, as well as economic development consulting, and really have our fingers in a lot of real estate development. Again, not just on the development side, but working between the public and private sectors. As Samir said earlier, that's what's beautiful about economic development, is that you get to kind of see both sides of the picture. And so our role is often to translate, again, using Samir's word, translate between developers and the public sector in some way, shape, or form. So it's a really interesting perch for us, and we really appreciate the work that we get to do with some of you all out there. So we'll dive right in. This starts to bump up against what I might consider economic development 202 almost. So if you think about, as we talk about often in plans that we do for our clients, we talk about strategies, and then we talk about tactics, right? And the tactics are used to execute the strategies. And so you've heard a lot of kind of strategic thinking, big picture thinking about how planning and economic development fit together. And so now we're kind of into the tactics mode, at least a little bit with what I'm getting into, is what are some of the tactics that are being used to execute the economic development vision, and how do planners have a role in figuring that out, and where do they play? So some of this will be somewhat elementary to you because we're just going to talk about tools. Some of you, particularly if you're new at City Hall or in your office, in the planning office, these may be things that you've heard, but didn't really know what they mean. They may be things you haven't heard at all, but you might hear a year from now. And so really trying to kind of get into sort of what are the tools, what are the tactics. All right, here we go. Trying to advance the slides and I'm muting instead. Let's see. There we go. All right. Okay, so here we go. One-on-one tools. So you see a list here. This is a list. I'm sure you've heard of many, if not most of these things on this list. I will in the next 25 minutes now, 20 minutes now, really focus largely on the last two that are highlighted in blue. Those are really some very specific tools that folks are using, again, throughout the state to get big things done. But it doesn't mean they're the only tools. And absolutely, you've heard of opportunity zones, both state and federal, which I'll point out. If you hear the word opportunity zone, you should ask, do you mean state or do you mean federal? Because state and federal opportunity zones, absolutely, positively, very, very different things. They just happen to have the same, they happen to both be economic development tools and happen to both have the same name, but state opportunity zone, federal OZs, two different things. Lots of tax credit programs that are being used as tools. That seems to be kind of the vehicle that particularly the federal government likes to use, but also the state government in terms of rather than just grants to folks, it's really money that goes into deals often comes in the form of tax credits. And some of those at the federal level, new market tax credits, CDBG funds, right? You've probably heard these things. Historic property tax credits for your downtown. Absolutely, positively wonderful tools to help enhance your downtowns, prop up your downtowns, and the old buildings, because those old buildings are assets. Those old buildings in your downtown, even if they're almost falling over, I promise you, can be put back onto the rolls and used as a way to attract visitors, to attract jobs, to attract residents to your downtown. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, but if there's one thing I could say to preach to you today is look at your assets in your historic downtowns, see if you've got ways to use historic property tax credits to get them up to shape, modernized, and they will absolutely become economic development assets. And I'd be happy to talk more about that in a different discussion. Again, other grants and loans, economic opportunity funds, even to the extent that planners, particularly, you all know a lot about the fees that are charged for development. You know about how folks have to pay to get their sewer and water taps hooked up, et cetera. All of those can be tools for economic development to try to get new and interesting development where you want it in your town. But particularly, as I said, we're going to focus largely on two tools, and really I'm going to spend a lot of time on TADs, but we will also talk about what are often called abatements, tax abatements. And it's in quotes because it's not really a tax abatement, at least not in Georgia, the way it's set up. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. So at the heart of a lot of these tools, particularly when it comes to tax abatements and when it comes to TADs and TIFs, which we'll talk about, at the heart of this, at the heart of the public sector's involvement in the private sector development, otherwise known as P3s, public-private partnerships, right? Scale of public-private partnerships can be very, very large. They don't have to be very, very large, however. The public sector can get involved with the private sector in a lot of different ways to enhance economic development. If it ends up being a somewhat larger project, if it's a project with construction costs of maybe, say, 15 to 20 million, that starts to put you in the universe of potentially using bonds as an economic development tool. And this can be very detailed. You can get deep into the weeds talking about bonds really quick, and you would be bored to death. So I'm not going to get deep into the weeds on bonds, but I do want to at least throw out some terms, some buzzwords, some things that you should be familiar with. Again, at the heart of economic development in your city, in your county, often will come to bonds, and they will either be general obligation bonds or revenue bonds. General obligation bonds, some people call them GO bonds for obvious reasons. That is kind of your typical way to finance public infrastructure. It is based on the backing up those bonds would be the full faith and credit of the government typically, right? So we need new roads, we need new sewers, we need new big public goods. If you're familiar with that term, public goods, how do we pay for it? Well, road generally doesn't pay for itself. Sewer lines typically don't pay for themselves. Streetlights don't pay for themselves. So we're going to borrow money going out maybe even 40 years, and we're going to back that bond with the full faith and credit of the government being able to collect taxes to pay that, pay off that borrowing of money. That's typical. That's often, has nothing to do with economic development, at least not directly. Revenue bonds are really where economic developers often spend a lot of time working with bond attorneys and other consultants to get revenue bonds done in order to pay for public goods, often as part of public-private partnerships. So in other words, a developer might have an idea for development that might attract jobs, and it might want to be on an empty block downtown or an empty field on the outskirts of town, and it needs infrastructure. It needs sewer, it needs electric, it needs streets, it needs streetlights, it needs sidewalks, it needs all the things that a development needs. And much of that is public infrastructure, right? Those things that don't necessarily pay for themselves. And so in order to get economic development done, often the public sector will say, all right, let's partner up, developer. You're building this stuff. We'll pay, at least in part or in whole, for those public goods that are part of your project. You do the vertical, you do the private part, we do the public part. We've got a public-private partnership. That new development will create new tax, a higher, greater tax digest, a higher tax collections, whether it be property taxes, sales taxes, et cetera. And so what will happen often with bonds is that future income stream of future increased taxes will be monetized, right? So we can look forward, we can say, over the next 20 years, this project will create X amount of new taxes. A revenue bond will allow you to tap into that future income stream of taxes to pay for the infrastructure up front. And we'll talk a little bit more about this when we talk about TADs, but that's the idea. And those bonds, instead of being backed by the full faith and credit of the taxpayers of the city overall, those revenue bonds get paid back just by the new taxes, the new public revenue being created on site. So the taxpayers aren't on the hook if the city issues a revenue bond for a development. So that is a general overview of bonds. Again, some of you may be very familiar with that. And if that's all you ever know, what I've just said, you probably know enough to get by as a planner, at least in the short term, until somebody drags you in deeper, and then you got to go learn more, and you can give me a call. But again, one of the tools that often these bonds come into play with, and that folks are using throughout the state of Georgia literally on a daily basis, are what we call TADs, or tax allocation districts. Everybody else in the country calls it TIF. And in fact, this is our TIF program in Georgia. It's just when they wrote the law in the mid-'80s, they decided to call it TAD, tax allocation district. But it really is our way to do tax increment financing. And again, just implicit in that word, tax increment, was just what I described when I was talking about bonds, the revenue bonds, that we're going to create incremental new taxes to pay off infrastructure, to monetize that future income stream, pay it off today. And tax increment financing allows us to do this. And again, just want to point out, this is a mainstream tool, and we will talk a little bit more about that. But before we get into it, before we talk too much about TADs, just curious, in a poll, if you want to put your answers in the chat. If we do, does your community have? Oh no, we're doing it on the pollev.com. Do you have a TAD in your community? Either yes, no, you're working on it, you would like one, or you don't know. And this honestly will help me kind of figure out how I need to talk about TADs. And so over a third of you aren't sure. So that tells me you potentially don't know a ton about TADs, which is fine. That's why we're here, Economic Development 101. So again, for those of you saying yes, you have a TAD in your community, I assume some of you know what a TAD is. Some of you may know you have one, but you don't know how it works. Some of you saying no might wish you had one, but you still, you may or may not know how it works. So I'm gonna assume that about half of you are really kind of TAD newbies, don't know a lot about TADs, and so we'll make sure to keep this, focused on for you folks. And if those of you that do know a lot about TADs, hopefully this is a good review for you. And feel free to chime in as we move along. So again, appreciate your input on this. Let's see. I think we have a good sense if we want to move forward. Let's see if I'm able to advance this. Or let's see. 3 TADs in Carroll County right now. All right. We're doing a housing study for Carrollton right now, so I'm looking forward to seeing what comes out of Carroll County from a TAD perspective to maybe get some additional housing or other economic development accomplished. All right, I say we keep moving forward, but Molly or Nick, there we go. All right, so again, my sermon on TADs is these are mainstream tools. This is not necessarily exotic, and maybe 20 years ago, when we really first started using TADs in Georgia, people started thinking of them as maybe exotic, or maybe things that only the big city does, because Atlanta has 10 TADs, the most in the state of any city. But I want to point out that it's not only the big cities, right? And there are ways to use TADs that Atlanta doesn't necessarily use, or isn't the main way Atlanta does it. We've got a lot of small town clients throughout Georgia that are using TADs. Columbus isn't a small town, but not as big as Atlanta. They've got 8 TADs. Gwinnett County has 6 TADs. So there's a lot of great uses in a lot of different ways for TADs all throughout Georgia, big, medium, and small cities. So where and why would you use a TAD? Well, there's a lot of reasons why, and let me just say now up front that there is a law that governs this, right? There is a law that we'll talk about, that I will continue to talk about, that governs the use of TADs. And it is explicit about where and why a TAD can be used. But in the law itself, it says this law shall be used liberally to achieve economic development goals. So there are very explicit things in this law, but it also leaves some latitude about how to use a TAD. And that's when it gets fun, because you can do some interesting economic development with a TAD. But generally, where we see TADs being used and where the law allows TADs being used, locations where values are stagnant, declining due to a lack of investment, right? So it could be an old historic part of downtown that has just not gotten a lot of love. That could be a great place for a TAD. This declining property values. There could be values, again, within your community that we know are valuable, but they're not growing for whatever reason. They're not growing as fast as the community overall. So that's a very specific thing in the TAD law that says if you have an area that's not growing as fast as your overall city tax digest, that area could be eligible for a TAD to attract some investment. Again, you're trying to stimulate growth with TADs or manage growth with TADs. So you can use it to create new or higher density nodes to diversify the types of development you have. It's not always just about attracting any development. You can use TADs, you can justify using TADs to say, well, we know a development will show up here, but it's not going to be quite the level that we want it to be. So, or we know it'll show up, but it's going to take a lot of time to get here. And you can use TADs to really accelerate development coming quicker and at a higher level than would have otherwise been feasible if the market was left to its own devices. Again, these are just a lot of ideas. This is not the whole scope and scale of how TADs can and should be used, but just to kind of give you a sense, it's mostly what might be called declining areas. And so there are different types of TADs. Now, you won't find this in the law, right? The law says, here's how TADs can work, here's where TADs can work, but precedent has shown us that there are different types of TADs all throughout Georgia. There's some that we call area-wide TADs. So again, if you've got a downtown master plan, maybe you end up with a downtown TAD to try to again, execute that master plan, to get the projects done that were envisioned by the community in that master plan. And so it can become an area-wide TAD to incentivize or otherwise assist development in an entire area, or it could be a very specific project that you're trying to get done. And we'll talk about one in just a minute. Again, it can be used for infrastructure. It can be used simply to incentivize something getting built, bricks and mortar. A TAD can be used, or even a tax abatement can be used to incentivize developers just to show up. But usually it's somewhere in between. Usually a TAD is incentivizing a developer by getting the infrastructure done. But it doesn't have to even involve a developer necessarily. If you know the developers are coming, but you need to get a trail done through where development is happening, that could be an infrastructure TAD. You don't have to incentivize developers. You can take advantage of the fact that developers are there and growing the tax base, but getting infrastructure put in place to allow additional development to come. And again, you can use the traditional TIF way of TADs, tax increment financing, or there's something we call PAYGO that we can, maybe that's more of a 202 discussion. All right. So next, I mentioned a trail, right? So here's the Atlanta Beltline, which but for the Atlanta Beltline TAD, we wouldn't have an Atlanta Beltline in the city of Atlanta. So TAD is at the heart of the Atlanta Beltline, and you can see the private development organizing itself around the public investment. And that's classic use of TAD. Public infrastructure attracting private development in an area that may not otherwise have gotten that development without that infrastructure in place. And so that's really what TADs are meant for. Again, this would be considered an area-wide TAD. But again, it doesn't have to be a big city trail project in Atlanta. It could be a small town trail project or some other infrastructure project in your small town. And let's see, but the idea, I said that, but for, right? And so that's often one of the tests is that for TADs particularly, but also for tax abatements that planners and economic developers ought to be asking themselves, right? To say, okay, we have this vision in our plan, in our minds, council has a vision for this plot of land, and the developers aren't really sure they want to do it. But if we are to help them through doing infrastructure or giving them grants through our TAD program, but for our help, the government's help, it wouldn't get built otherwise, right? And so that's what cities often ask developers. But what's your but for, right? What's your but for? Would you get it done? Maybe, maybe not. But for the public sector getting involved in that private sector development, but for that involvement from the public sector, it wouldn't get done otherwise. That's kind of the big idea with any sort of economic development tool. That's usually the justification, that the public sector needs to get involved so you get the project that you want and that your community has envisioned over time. All right, so here you go. This may or may not be a familiar picture to you, but back in the 50s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, steel was a major industry at the city of Atlanta, and we had a steel mill. But eventually, that steel mill went dark, and we ended up with this, right? 30 years later, we end up with this, and I'm assuming that many of you know what you're looking at here. This is Atlantic Station. So we went from the Atlantic Steel operation to Atlantic Station, and it was really Georgia's first major use of TADs to get this done. And by the way, this isn't done yet. This is Atlantic Station. As it sits today, is less than 80% complete. So this TAD is still working the benefit to the city of Atlanta to grow the tax base. So when you invite a TAD into your community, in some communities, I'll say, folks in the community see that word tax right there at the beginning of tax allocation district, and they get scared, right? And so it's important, I think, at least to understand that a TAD is a mechanism to recirculate future tax revenues within a designated site, right? So that's the idea, is that we're creating new tax revenue and we're going to use that for a limited amount of time to help get infrastructure done on site. And so even if you are in an area-wide TAD, maybe you're not even participating in this development, redevelopment, it doesn't increase your taxes. There isn't necessarily anything on your tax bill that will change, other than if you look closely here, you might see the word TAD listed, but it doesn't change any of your millage rates. It doesn't change when your taxes are due. It is invisible largely to property tax owners. Not property tax owners, but to property owners on their tax bill. And okay, so this, if you ever have seen anybody try to explain a TAD to you, you most likely have seen this illustration. This is kind of the classic TAD TIF way to explain how TIFs work. And without going on too long here, because M's starting to run out of time, you basically with a TAD in Georgia, and again, every state's TIF program is different, or the way it works is can be a little bit different. But in Georgia, the idea is that when you set up a TAD, again, either on a specific site or in an area-wide TAD, you're locking in the property values. You're locking, this is all about property values. This is not about sales taxes. This is about property values, and you lock them in. And so when a TAD is put in place on a property or a collection of properties, whatever property taxes are being collected off that today will continue to be collected off of those properties, right? So that's called locking in the base. So whatever's there today will continue to flow into the general fund of the community. It's only the new taxes that are kind of in play, if you will, right? And so getting the new private sector development done within your TAD increases the property tax values. And it's those increases that are on the table to, as I said before, monetize and use to put back into the property to pay for infrastructure, to pay for other elements of the development. And so now you are accelerating your tax base. Now that property is worth 10 times maybe. I don't know exactly what it's going to be, but maybe it's worth 10 times more now when you've got a development there than it did pre-development. And so it's those new property taxes that are helping to fund the new development and the infrastructure for such. But this is a long game. And this is something a lot of people forget about TADs. It's a long game. All right. The long game says we are, quote unquote, giving up these taxes into the general fund, even though only for the use of TADs would these new taxes be created anyway. But the idea is that in 20 years, potentially when the TAD burns off, now we've got this super accelerated tax base and all the additional taxes flow to the general fund. So that's the kind of idea behind TADs, how they work, and what happens eventually is that you're growing the overall tax base, and that's good for the community overall. All right, so going to try to accelerate here a little bit, but you should know that to set up a TAD, you've got to write a redevelopment plan. And please know that the law that governs this is Chapter 36, Title 44 of the Georgia Code. You may not need to remember that, but you should know that to set up a TAD, you need to have a very specific redevelopment plan that is focused only on the TADs. If you have a redevelopment plan in place, that is most likely not going to help you get a TAD done. To set up a TAD, you've got to write a redevelopment plan. And that's one of the things that my company will do, is to help you write a TAD plan. And there is a process to go through. And this is just kind of a flow chart of how this works. First of all, to even be able to do a TAD, your community, the voters in your community, your residents have to vote the authority to do TADs. You've got to get that authority from the voters first. Once they give you the ability to do TADs, then you can do TADs however you'd like. And so the other thing I'll say here, and then move on quickly, is that a city can set up a TAD, but for the county and the school's tax digest to be included in the TAD, they also have to affirm their participation. So a city can set up a TAD, but the county and the schools get to choose whether or not they participate. And that's a whole entire different conversation that we can get into offline. So again, there's a lot of examples. These are pictures from Duluth. If you've been to downtown Duluth, the TAD was the key element to helping Duluth get redeveloped in the way that it did, typically used for site improvements, but also to help incentivize, get developers there before folks could envision really what downtown Duluth was going to look like. Let's see, next slide. Again, here's Duluth, and just on the left, you can see all the tools that they use to help get their project done, TAD being one of them, abatements being another. But it takes a lot of work from planning to develop the vision in order to kind of toss it over to economic development to say, now let's get this done. Let's see. All right. So again, Duluth is a great example. I'm just going to kind of run through to throw out a couple other words. East Point is one of the most successful TADs. Camp Creek Parkway right off of 285. If you've been by there, that was an East Point TAD that has been wildly successful. Without that TAD, we may not have had that shopping in that underserved market in East Point there on Camp Creek Parkway. Let's see, next slide. This is a newer TAD. You may have driven up 85. You've seen the Exchange at Gwinnett being built, but for a TAD, Gwinnett would not have the new mixed-use development and Top Golf there along 85. That was a TAD project as well. So I think that's about it. I think we need to probably get to the end to say that the TADs can be a tool to work as economic development. And the last thing I'll say about this is density as a tool as well. And this may or may not involve TADs, may or may not involve tax abatement. You may be in a community where TADs aren't allowed. But one way to really grow your tax digest, which is ultimately one of the important reasons for economic development, is to really focus on density, right? And so this is in Woodstock, Georgia, where they have, and again, this kind of proves that, why not both, as the famous meme goes, why not both, right? If you're an economic developer and you're only looking to develop that single level 50-acre site out by the interstate, that's fine, all right? That's a perfectly reasonable goal for an economic developer to get the industrial park filled up or to attract the outlet mall. But at the same time, you should not lose focus from an economic development point of view on your downtown as well, because at the end of the day, when you measure the development on a per acre basis, and this is a metric that more and more people are using, not just looking at how many taxes we've collected, but how many taxes we collected on a per acre basis in any particular project, because that really talks about, or that really gets to the efficiency of your land use. If you can get over $3 million an acre of value in your downtown, you will far exceed the value on a per acre basis of the Walmart or of the strip mall or of the outlet mall on the outskirts of town. So just pursuing density helps grow the tax base. And we can see it in downtown Woodstock. We can see it in downtown Atlanta. This happens to be Midtown Atlanta, where the Peachtree corridor is only 3% of the property in the city of Atlanta, but it accounts for 32% of the overall property tax digest. So again, efficiency. And so being able to collect property taxes on a small amount of land allows you to do things like have world-class parks right next door, like Piedmont Park, because now you can pay for it. So a little bit over time, I apologize for that. Let's see. So we have a poll available. What are the opportunities for planners to engage in TAD? So anyone have any thoughts about where, as a planner, you might fit into this whole economic development discussion and using some of these tools, again, whether it be TADs or otherwise?
Yeah, and I just want to be mindful of time because we've got a couple more folks to go, and we promised we'd wrap up by 12:30. Jeff did an excellent job about talking about TADs. To me, are so key when it comes to economic development and also really creating the vision that the community had. So what I'd like to do is some of the chat, we will pull that for the end. when we've got some Q&A time, and you know, we're thinking that maybe we need to do another session on TADS, just devoted to TADS. Like you said, this is sort of the brief overview, but I think this is one of the economic development tools that really gets us to where we're trying to go, the community vision for development and being able to finance and fund that. Especially when you look at density. You know, I know as a planner, sometimes it's hard to sell density to folks, or an economic developer. We put together strategic plans and I say, hey, you know, you really need to have some density, and that's a dirty word. When you start to show the ROI on density, I think that actually can, and you talk about it as being confined, not entirely taking over community and changing its character. I think sometimes that can help allay some fears. But numbers always help. I know Kevin's going to talk about that at the end as well. But you know, numbers are always key in how to finance these things, and how to finance the infrastructure and the amenities, and you know, the basics of what you need to be successful. So if you don't mind, I'm going to hold those questions. Are you okay with that, Jeff? Thank you so much. Again, we'll hang on to these questions and these comments, and I think we'll probably engage with something a little bit different later on, more detail, because we did have so many that were not as familiar and maybe might want to see that happen. So I'm going to turn this over to our little panel. It's actually a pretty big panel when you look at who's going to be talking. Some really wonderful speakers. We've got Christopher Pike, who's going to lead us off. And then we'll move to Steve Foster to talk about industrial development, and then Sherlyn Fortson with commercial development, and then Christopher will come back and talk about small business. I'm going to take a really brief second just to read everybody's bios, because I want to be fair, and then we'll get you started. Okay, Christopher? So Christopher is not only the city's new economic development administrator in South Fulton, he is the man, the myth, and the legend. That was his original bio. He most recently was the city of Villa Rica's director of economic development. He established a convention and visitors bureau and an office of film and entertainment. So this is some of the cultural developments, the way we see our identities, our city's identity, community's identity. He secured $1.4 million in funding for downtown projects. He has an MS degree in management from Troy State University and a bachelor's in criminal justice from Albany State University, which just goes to show you that you can evolve into economic development and become a major champion. You don't have to know that by birth. So with that, I'll let you, well, let me say that. Let me just introduce Steve and Sherlyn real quickly. Steve is a community development manager for Georgia Power, serving the city of Atlanta, Cherokee, Cobb, Douglas, and Paulding counties. He advises and supports communities in his area on economic development, zoning, tourism, land use, transportation, and business retention. So he has a lot of overlap with what we've talked about already. Internal to Georgia Power, and this is why actually we wanted to make sure Georgia Power was involved as an example of a utility who can help facilitate, who is a partner in economic development. It's not just the the city or government. We even talked about grassroots groups as well. He advises the company on demographic and business trends, community planning, and infrastructure. Sherlyn is the economic development director for the city of Brookhaven, and prior to her current role, she was a statewide project manager at the Georgia Department of Economic Development on their corporate headquarters team. She is, and I will not hold this against her, she is a proud bulldog. So anyway, with that, I will I'll let you get started, and then we'll move into the industrial. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Lynn. I appreciate the great introduction. I want to say for the record that I forgot to send in a bio. So Lynn made that up on her own. So I think she did a really good job with the kind introduction. I'm going to get us back on track a little bit with time. And so I'm going to be very brief, but I'm kind of pulling everything together and how we get projects done when it comes to economic development. And I think the important part for us to understand is there's a private role, or the private sector role, and there's a public sector role. And I'm going to speak first about the public sector and how those things come together from a planning side, and how we work together with planners to really make economic development happen in our communities. And I want to say some of my folks from the city of South Fulton are on this call. And so I put this PowerPoint together with them in mind so that they understand that I value them and I appreciate them. And even though we don't always see eye to eye, I do understand the work that they do and the importance that it plays into helping our community move forward. So having said that, one of the things I think is vitally important that we understand from an economic development standpoint is that it's our job to really help the community be what it wants to be. When I first took the job here in the city of South Fulton, everybody kept asking me, well, what's your vision for the community? And I was like, I don't have a vision for the community. That's not my job. My job is to help the citizens realize what they want their community to be and then use my expertise to help make those things come to fruition. And so planning and having a long-term plan is a really important part of that. We're in the process right now of doing the comprehensive plan update for the city of South Fulton. This is our first one that's for the city. Since the city was created, we adopted the one that Fulton County had done. So we're in full-fledged redoing ours. And we are working jointly with our planning and community development department to really help bring that project to fruition and something that the community can be engaged in. One of the things that comes out of obviously your planning is regulations. And so I have to deal with a lot of regulations because our community development department and our planning, they love regulations. And so it's important for me to know what they are so I don't get slapped on the hand when I tell developers that they can and cannot do something. And so we work hand in hand to kind of understand what those codes and ordinances are and how those affect how we create the built environment. And so when we talk to developers, I know, okay, well, our regulations don't allow us to build a 30-story building in the city of South Fulton. So those are things that we need to know when we're talking to developers about particular projects and things that they want to do in our community. And those things help to inform what our goals are around economic development. And this is really an important part because we want to understand, what that collective vision is for the community, but that strategic plan that we create to achieve those goals are going to really set the standard for what we do. And so I also want to point out, because it was mentioned earlier about target industries, this is really where you identify for your community what your target industries are. They're not the same for every community. And so you want to make sure that you spell that out in your strategic plan, what businesses that we're going to go after. You can even get to is down to the level of where are these things going to happen. So for example, in our economic development strategic plan, we have identified development nodes throughout our city where we are going to have higher density developments. And so we've already identified those in our strategic plan around economic development. That strategic plan and the information doesn't just flow one way like I have the arrows. That what we came through with our strategic plan around economic development is also informing what we're doing with our comprehensive plan update. And so those 9 commercial nodes are actually going into our comprehensive plan. So all of those documents speak to one another. And that's important for us to be on the same page with planning and economic development so that we're not kind of in silos working to create these documents that are in conflict with one another. And so those help to form how we operate from economic development department and planning and zoning. And so those kind of provide the foundation of how we're going to move forward, how we're going to work with the private sector when it relates to them wanting to build things in our community. The other thing that I think is important to understand, and this goes into what Jeff talked about right before me, is the strategic plan and all of these other documents, the TAD helps kind of inform those things as well. And so our strategic plan talks about how do we utilize our TADs, where are those TADs? And of course, we have an economic development redevelopment plan that's connected to our tax allocation district, but it then also goes back to our strategic plan, and also that document will inform what we're doing around the comp plan. And so our job is to then be the conduit for how the public or for how the private sector interacts with the public sector. And so from a private standpoint, when we get a call or someone is interested in our community, they're going to call and they're going to do what I call due diligence on a community. And there's a lot of things that happen during that process. But the biggest thing that they're trying to figure out is, do they fit, or does the community fit what they're trying to accomplish from a business standpoint, whether it be an industrial development or a retail development, even a residential development. They want to make sure that what they're doing fits in with the overall vision and goals of the community. And I also want to point out that this is also the time when they start looking at all of those incentives. So they're looking at tax allocation districts. Do you have those? How can they utilize those to help their development if needed? Tax abatements. Does your community offer tax abatements? If they do, what do those look like? If you provide any type of other incentives, like for example, one of the things that we have here in the city of South Fulton is the Economic Development Incentive Ordinance. Well, it spells out what incentives we can provide to include things like expedited permitting, reduction in permitting fees and business license and those type things. And so that's what they're going to be doing from in that analysis of the market, in addition to just making sure that they can get all the services that they need. A lot of times they're going to come and they're going to have a site kind of in mind. The beautiful thing about that is they've, you know that they're really making a concerted effort to kind of come to your community. The bad part about that is if they have their site set on a site that is not properly zoned, then we start getting into issues. And so at this point, when they call me and they're trying to look at a site, we generally like to try to have some dialogue with some planners at this point in the process, because if we know that this is something that is not going to work in our future land use, I'd rather them know that in the beginning and not by the time they've done a lot of investing in a specific site. So I think it's important, and this process is going to be different in different communities. I think it's worth noting that when you are a city employee that's an economic development team, it's a lot easier because obviously I have direct access to city planners. If you're a nonprofit entity that's doing economic development for a community, you may not have that direct contact with them. But from a planning standpoint, it's in your best interest to make sure that those folks are at the table in a properly appropriate for the time frame or from the timeline, but pretty early on. When we bring in large developments, for example, we're working on a 200-acre development in the city of South Fulton. We actually called in not only the planners, but the engineers and the fire chief and the police chief and community development director and other people that are involved so that they could talk to the developer at the very beginning, because they want to make sure their site plans are right, that they're looking at things that fit in our community. And that helped out because now the planners and everyone are invested in the development as much as economic development folks are. So you want to be very intentional about making sure that you have folks at the table so that they can then have their input, and makes it go a lot smoother. And then after that, you go into the land acquisition. And then after land acquisition, if it needs to be rezoned or if there's some any type of other variances that they need, obviously we want to get those to the planners, but hopefully the planners are aware of those things before they get to the acquisition point. I do want to point out that, in any one of these phases in the private sector, it really just depends on the business. Some folks come and they've already have everything laid out and we're a very small piece of it. Other times, the company or the developer will come to us and we're involved in the beginning and we're helping, as I say, grease the wheels on the whole process. So it really just depends. No two projects are the same. This is just kind of a very high level layout of how the process works to get it to the planning team. And again, any number of these things can change just depending upon the circumstances with the particular business or industry. Again, I want to just say that, I appreciate the opportunity to work with our planners. I find them to be very insightful, and a lot of times, 90% of the time, we're on the same page about the direction for the community, but we definitely make sure that we keep them plugged in and that they have a big part of what goes on in economic development. So I'm going to stop there because I know that we have some other speakers, and then I'll come back in on the back end and close it out.
Thanks, Christopher. Steve's gonna take the wheel. He's gonna give you about a 10-minute talk on industrial recruitment and sort of how that comes and is accomplished on his perspective. So Steve, take it away.
All right, very good. Thank you, Lynn. And thank you, Chris. That's a great setup for what I've discussed. And let me see if I can get these slides to move. I am not getting them in advance. Lynn, would you mind advancing them, please? Sorry. There we go. Who are the players in economic development, especially industrial recruitment? And you have a lot of partners. I think Samir mentioned it's a team sport, and it truly is. You got the client, the state, the Metro Atlanta Chamber, the utilities like Georgia Power, but our EMC partners and also our MEAG partners, local development authorities like Samir, and then our local chambers and municipalities and developers. Of that, think about the most important here is the client and the product they're looking for. And who determines the product they're looking for are those local municipalities, those planners and those municipalities, and those developers. Developers will make money, they'll invest where they can make money, and you have to provide them the opportunity to make money. Going back to Jeff's comment about TADS, the creation of the Beltline has created a lot of opportunities for a lot of developers to make a lot of money. Now that changes the whole dynamics of the community sometimes, but it helps raise the tax base and provides higher density for the community and higher economic throughput. Again, I'm having problems here. There we go. Now, Lynn had mentioned earlier, we have preferred targets in the state, and the state set this up to look, if you think about increasing the economic output of the state, the GDP, if you will, they pick these particular targets, and I'm not going to read them all for you, but they all require all higher value processing and also export product outside of the state. And that's what you really want to do to help bring more money into the state. Some of these are very, very valuable. And, like our film and digital media and film is bringing a lot of money to the state. We're putting a lot of money in the tax bases for that, the tax credits for that, but it brings a lot of economic vitality we didn't have previously. Next slide. And then, why? It creates high value added jobs for our citizens. We want to make more money. Everybody wants to make more money. Equities have. We want to increase our tax base for our state, but also for the local communities, the cities, the counties, and then we want to utilize the resources we've put into our infrastructure. Whether it be the port, which has been a great asset for the state, the airport that the Atlanta has built over the years is one of the busiest, and our university system. All those are assets that we use to help attract more business here. And, we want to make sure we're fully utilizing those assets. And think about Georgia, we're not in a vacuum here. We're in a highly competitive environment, not only regionally, nationally, but internationally. And it's a lot of effort that goes into attracting business to the state. And we want to make sure that we get a good return on that investment. And then if you're able to get those businesses here, you also have a great halo effect. That economic vitality helps your downtowns. It helps your community. It helps your restaurants. It helps your hospitality. It helps your tourism. It helps a lot of things. And so there's a multiplier effect that a lot of people talk about. And our next one there, Lynn. And then So what do they really require for a location? Think about this, and what's a really, really simple answer to this question? What do industrial projects require?
Nick, can you, yeah, thank you.
All right, want to answer give us the poll here? A lot of good answers showing up here. All right, Lynn, I think we have enough answers here. We have a lot of answers here, and they're all good here, by the way. But the reality is, the easy answer is the best place that meet all of their requirements and where they're wanted. And if you think about the location process, all of these industries have a choice. They could be looking for workforce, they could be looking for land, they could be looking for power, they could be looking for water, they could be looking for rail, they could be looking for a lot of different things, or a combination of these things like the airport or the port. And what our job from economic development professionals are, and this goes to the state, and Cheryl Lynn used to do this when she was doing office recruitment, is to help find the best place in the state for their business. And if you have all the elements in place, the space, the land, the infrastructure, the workforce, those kinds of things that are most important these days, then you have an opportunity to compete. If you don't have those in place, you don't have that opportunity to compete. And this competition starts a long time before they contact the state or the Metro Atlanta Chamber or the Georgia Power or their EMC partners. A lot of times our communities can be eliminated, our state can be eliminated before they even know there's a prospect, a project out there. And if you think about perception being reality, sometimes it is. And if we're perceived as not having any water like we were about 10 or 15 years ago when we had that in the middle of the drought, oh, Atlanta, Georgia doesn't have enough water. That takes a long time for us to overcome. And that's why that infrastructure component is very, very important. And what we have to do is tell that best story for the state, but also can help tell that story for your community as well. Therefore, it's really important that we know your story and what you're anxious for, what kind of industry you'd like to attract, what you will tolerate, what you won't tolerate. And so that the partners, the state, project managers, Metro Atlanta Chamber partners, and Georgia Power or other utilities help tell the best story about your community, and then make sure that you're in a competitive opportunity. Because if one of the things we do not want to hear from anybody is, why did you take me there? And therefore, we try not to do that very, very hard. Our next slide, please. And so it all starts with the client, what their needs are, not our needs. We may want aerospace, for example, but it's what the client's looking for, not what we want. And so then they contact the state, the utility partner with an RFP, request for proposal. And that may be issued by a site location consultant or directly from the company. We do a very good job. The Metro Atlanta Chamber and the Atlanta region does an excellent job of marketing the region to these site location consultants. They work nationally and sometimes internationally. And so a lot of our efforts are really kind of geared toward making them aware of what we have available here in the local community. Once that RFP is forwarded to the local ED contact like Sumir or Chris or Sherilyn, they have a very limited amount of time to respond. And they have to be able to complete that RFP as completely as possible, as quickly as possible. This is one of the things that's changed over time, and Lynn can testify to that. Back in the day, and I say back in the day, say 20 years ago, before the internet was widely used like it is now, you may have several weeks to respond. These days, you may only have a week to respond, and you have to get this information out to the communities and back from the communities and issue to that location consultant within a week. And that takes a lot of turnaround. You have to have all your answers in advance, you know what about your community, what it will and won't do, and be able to respond very, very quickly. And when you get down to it, if you're lucky if you get a visit, I mean, quite frankly, I mean, you may issue, 15 or 20 responses back to that location consultant. That may be whittled down to 4 or 5. And then he may get that site visit, to 3 or 4. And so if you get a site visit, it's very, very important to respond to that lead project manager, whoever that is for the state of Metro Atlanta Chamber, Georgia Power, to make sure that you stay on time, that you show them what they want to see, you answer their questions very, concisely, and because they may only have 30 minutes to be there, in your community. And then once you got that location decided upon, that's when the hard part starts for the local community and getting that second visit, those negotiations, and getting that location located. From a planner's perspective, that's when you have to make sure that what they're proposing definitely matches your requirements in terms of zoning and height, for your fire, your setbacks, your noise abatement, those kinds of things. So I want to turn it over to Sherilyn and Lynn.
Yeah,
and we'll
thanks,
answer
Steve.
any questions later on.
Perfect. Yeah, we'll talk about how planners can engage in each of these recruitment or the economic development gets done. Sherilyn, I'm going to pass it over to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Looks like I don't have. Can we go to the next slide, please? All righty. So I don't know about you, but before I got into economic development, I had no idea what it was or what we even did. Of course, I'd hear stories about companies moving here, and I saw all of the corporate headquarters that were here, but I had no idea there was such a robust ecosystem working to recruit these companies. So the first question I like to ask is, where do these projects come from in the first place? The truth is all sorts of places, from site selectors, developers, consultants, and a myriad of other partners that Steve already mentioned, such as Georgia Power, the Department of Economic Development, the Metro Atlanta Chamber, especially when you're talking about corporate headquarters relocation projects. A lot of people don't know that Georgia Power was actually the first economic development agency in the state, and they have a vested interest in making sure that companies move here because obviously the more companies we have, the more power that is being used. As head of an economic development agency in DeKalb County, I also work very closely with Decide DeKalb, which is the economic development arm for the county. Next slide, please. So then the question becomes, once a company reaches out, what happens next? Phase one is what I like to call the inquiry phase. This is when a formal request comes in, and Steve touched on some of this as well. It's the same process for commercial projects. Typically, the prospect has never been to your community, so your response is their introduction to your city. The best way to do this is to be clear and thorough in your responses. Oftentimes, a statewide project manager is the liaison between you and the prospect, and they've narrowed it down to a few communities they feel that matches the prospect's desires. The way in which you respond to RFPs and what they know about your economic development agency can influence their decision of whether or not you would be a good fit for the prospect or even prospects in the future. RFPs are also a really great opportunity to bridge the gap between economic development and community development. Part of a prospect evaluating a community includes what it'll cost them to operate there. One of the common questions I get on RFPs, especially if a company plans to build their own building, is to calculate the cost of their building fees. So I oftentimes work with my community development department to get those numbers. Making sure that community development understands the urgency at which these RFPs oftentimes have to be submitted is important, so that you all don't think that we're just coming at you at the last minute. Many times we as economic developers get these RFPs in on a Monday evening and have to respond by close of business on Tuesday, which Steve touched on. Then we go into what I like to call the active project phase. This is where you are shortlisted. Your community, Prospect has looked at all the different communities from the RFPs, and they've shortlisted you. If you're lucky, you get to present directly to the prospect. And then if you're even more lucky, you get to show off the assets within your community to that prospect. Oftentimes in Georgia, this is being led by the Georgia Department of Economic Development. And again, for corporate headquarters projects, because they tend to be centered around the Metro Atlanta area, the Metro Atlanta Chamber will be part of that team, as well as Georgia Power. But that doesn't mean that the other utility partners are not involved either. Then phase 3 is what I like to say, okay, you've landed the project. This is the exciting part. This is the fancy part where you get the big press release. You have a ribbon cutting ceremony sometimes, or a groundbreaking ceremony. This is where the state Metro Atlanta Chamber kind of exits the conversation. They go on to do their work of recruiting even more companies, flying all over. I don't know how many of you won't know, but we have economic development offices all over the world, not just here in Georgia. And so they move on and do their thing. And now you, as a community leader, have to integrate the new businesses into your community, while also so part of this is making sure that they do the things they say they've promised to do. So it's not just you get the press release, they're there, and then it's done. You have to make sure they are getting through the permitting process, which means that you have to collaborate there as an economic developer, collaborate very closely with your community development department. Samir touched on business retention and expansion. That is where most of our workforce is. And so you have to make sure that you are staying in contact with those companies who have located in your community. Workforce development, and then the compliance piece, which again is making sure that they are delivering and doing the things that they said that they promised to do in exchange for being in your community. I won't spend too much time going into detail since Jeff covered a lot of this already, but I do want to talk briefly about property tax incentives. There's a perception that economic developers lead with property tax incentives when recruiting projects. In reality, less than 10% of all projects receive a property tax abatement. Furthermore, there are usually policies that reserve this type of tool for projects that are making a significant investment within a community. We have TADs and community investment districts, and which are used for improvements within a specific geographic area. And then this is another opportunity for community development and economic development to work together. Some communities, such as my community, we offer fee waivers and expedited permitting. That was a conversation I had to have very closely with my community development department. And it's important to know as an economic developer, whether or not your community development department is funded by fees. You can't go out and offer these incentives if your community development is depending on them. Brookhaven, a couple of years back, went through a rezoning process. And I worked very closely with my community development department to determine what we needed to include in our zoning code, especially for various areas around the city, that would not hinder my job of recruiting quality investment, but also make sure that the community was being heard and we were actively recruiting things that the community has said that they wanted to see. You can also, the other tools, you can also offer loans, small business loan, brownfield development loans. Workforce development, you can partner with your local or statewide workforce development organizations, universities, and professional organizations to tap into an educated workforce. And then on the statewide level, you have statewide job tax credit programs. So then how do decision makers determine if a community is a good fit? Accessibility is important. Can their future employees get to and from work? Education, does your community have access to an educated workforce? Quality of life, where does the CEO want to live versus where does the workforce want to live that they are looking to recruit? And I'll get into some of that when I get into project specific examples. Uh-oh. And then some other things, some other factors that decision makers consider are demographics. Is your community diverse? We know that diversity is a huge determining factor, especially in this day and age. Is your demographic highly educated? How old are they or how young are they? Schools, are there quality school choices within your community? And then something that a lot of people don't think about is reputation. Does your community have a good reputation and brand? Oftentimes, I think Steve mentioned this, sometimes a community or even a state is eliminated before they even know that they are on the list whatsoever. Prospects can sometimes go and watch your city council meetings. Is your city council one that is always bickering at meetings? Are there always issues? Are you always in the news for something negative? All of those things play a role when it comes to these decision makers deciding whether or not they want to come to your community. And then I'll just give two project examples. Mercedes-Benz and ThyssenKrupp. Mercedes-Benz was one of the first projects I had the opportunity to work on with my director at the time at the state. I think it's important to use these two as an example because oftentimes when you hear about corporate headquarters relocation, people think that they are only interested in the city of Atlanta. They want to be in Midtown, they want to be near Georgia Tech, which, you know, even though I'm a Bulldog, Georgia Tech is a great school and we use it a lot, especially when we're recruiting companies. But Mercedes-Benz, ThyssenKrupp, those are German-based companies and they are used to a campus style build out. So they wanted to be somewhere, they actually, Mercedes-Benz in Sandy Springs and ThyssenKrupp in Cobb County, they wanted to be somewhere where they could build and still have that campus feel. Transportation was a huge factor for them. Mercedes was probably one of the first times in a very long time that MARTA was at the table when this company was making a decision, and that was because transportation was so important to them. So all of those things, I want to make sure I point out that just because you may be a more suburban community does not mean that you're not a big contender for some of these corporate headquarters projects. So always keep that in mind. All the cards are always on the table, and make sure that you all are working closely together with your economic development department to have policies in place that are attractive to these decision makers, because sometimes, again, you're on lists that you don't even know about. And it looks like we have a poll question. What are opportunities for planners to engage in commercial recruitment?
Thanks, Sherlyn. That was great. I think those are points really well taken about you never know, people want to be, companies may want to be close to an area, but they don't want to be in an area. So that's really key. We're going to hold off on the poll. You all are welcome to put it in the chat. But what we're going to do is move over and let Christopher talk about small business. And then hopefully we'll have just a couple of minutes to circle back. There's so much good information here. We all could talk. We've had a great time planning this. We could talk for hours and hours, lots of anecdotes. So Christopher, you ready? I think he's ready. You there? You're on mute. There you go. Thanks.
I'm ready. The little icons at the bottom of my screen are gone. Turn on my camera. There we go. Whoever the host is did a great job. Again, thanks again, Lynn. And I just want to say, small business development and recruitment is something that I'm extremely passionate about. It's one thing as an economic development professional to recruit jobs to your community. It's another thing to help someone create a business and create generational wealth for their family. So I look at small business and the investment in small business to really be paramount in a community because we want to be focused on creating wealth and not just creating jobs. Now, not everybody wants to be a business owner, and so you still need those jobs, but you want to have a very robust small business recruitment and creation program within your city. And I'm going to say, just for the record, that I think in the city of South Fulton, we probably do it as good as any other city. Not just because I think that I do anything special, but just because it's supported by our mayor and council. They put resources into small business development. It's not just something that we give lip service to. And so I think it's something that's vitally important for a community. It's interesting when you say small business, most of us probably think about mom and pop local businesses, but really what is considered a small business really just depends on the industry. And so you have maximums of companies that are as large as 250 or 1,500, just depending on what segment that they fall into. There's an exhaustive list at SBA's website if you want to go and check that out. But I think it's important to understand why we support small businesses. They really do have a bigger impact on your community than larger companies. For example, almost 50% or $48 of every $100 spent stays in your local community. And I think that that's important when we start talking about recirculating money in a community and how that helps to create an environment for success for other people. And what I tell people all the time is, it's much easier to go into a locally owned business and ask them to sponsor the softball team than it is to go into one of these big companies that have to send something up to a corporate headquarters that you're probably never going to hear from again. So that's another important fact when you think about supporting a small business. They create a tremendous amount of jobs over the last 20 years. You can see just the amount of jobs that have been created by small businesses. I think the other thing that's really important to point out is that even in a pandemic that we've just been through in the last year, that there were 4.3 million new small businesses that were created during that time frame. So people really got an entrepreneurial spirit while they were sitting at home in quarantine. But I think it's important to also look at the fact that people in this country are very intentional about supporting small businesses and will actually spend a little bit of extra money to support a small business than they would to get and look for that discount. And there's ways that we can support small businesses. These are things that I have actually worked with our community development department here in the city of South Fulton. They actually, in the beginning, were managing the CDBG funds. We work with them to set aside right at $175,000 to almost $200,000 to support small businesses. So we started a facade grant program that will be kicking off in our Main Street programs. And we also set aside money for small business loans and grants. And so those are going to be intentional ways that we put resources into supporting small businesses, but also just being thoughtful about business license. Our community development and regulatory affairs director spearheaded the online permitting process, which kind of streamlined all of the things that businesses need to do so they could just go one place and get that information plugged in. So it makes it faster. As I tell people, especially like our accounting department and stuff like that, a small business can't wait 30, 40, 60 days to get paid or to get stuff processed. They need to get things moving because most of the time they have all of their personal savings tied up into the business. And so they need to get their money faster than a larger company. So being thoughtful about how, from a city processing side, we get resources to small businesses, I think is important. And the other thing that I'm going to talk about in the next slide is creating an incubator and some ways we've been successful doing that. And in identifying funding partners, we work with a lot of nonprofit, non-traditional lenders to help connect financing resources to small businesses. And then just thinking about how do we plan areas in our community that support small businesses, or some place that's going to be a hub for small businesses. And so we've been successful in getting from ARC some LCI and CDAP grants. And also, if you're not in the ARC area, the Carver Institute has the RSVP, which we did one of those out in Villa Rica when I was there. But those are great planning tools that if you use them right, or planning resources, if you use them right, you can put a plan together that also helps focus on small businesses and how we can provide resources to them as we think about moving our city forward. Here in the city of South Fulton, we created a small business resource center called Collab South. And at Collab South, we do multiple things there. It's a co-working space. It's actually where my office is. So that's where I am now. I'm in one of our co-working spaces. We actually have two, one in Red Oak and one in Old National. And these are areas that we're really focusing reinvestment in from a city standpoint. And so we are utilizing our resources to make sure that we're not only just creating new stuff, that we're actually going and revitalizing old areas or more depressed areas in our city, but for the purpose of creating entrepreneurship opportunities. And so what we do in Collab South is we create a curriculum with partners based on what the business segment is. And so if you're a restaurant, we pull in the resources to help you be successful in the restaurant. If you're a startup bakery, something like that, we will help with, get you in the right contacts and the right resources that you need to be successful, depending on whatever your business segment is. And we do that for the purposes of trying to create these businesses and then put them in the areas that we are revitalizing. And so that's why we have the co-working spaces or the incubators in each one of the areas that we're focusing on. One of the things that we did to be really intentional from a planning standpoint is to use our economic development incentive ordinance to really help provide an avenue for our small businesses as well. So for example, if you get an incentive, if you're a commercial real estate developer and you build a project and we provide incentives, in return, there's going to be some community benefits that come back to the community. One of the things that we've put in our ordinance is that once that incentive kicks in, when you build your development, you have to set aside 30% of your development for City of South Fulton owned businesses. And so to be able to make sure that we have what I call functioning credit-worthy businesses to plug into these set-asides that we have, we create the curriculum in Collab South that they go through. And then at the end of that program, they have set-asides in these new developments that they can go into. And so I think that's important from a planning standpoint to understand that, these are kind of the things that you have to, benchmarks that you have to hit to be able to be successful with a small business program and supporting small businesses. But we also provide technical training and other things as well. One of the things that we recognized early on during the pandemic is that a lot of our businesses weren't tech savvy and didn't have the resources necessary to switch to online. And so one of the things that we did was create a technology access grant where we provided resources to help get companies' websites and those things so that they could take online orders. We were trying to support businesses and they couldn't take credit cards over the phone. And so making sure that, you have those, you're focused on creating the resources and creating the environment for small business to be successful. Sometimes it means thinking outside of the box and utilizing, different resources and thinking about how you provide assistance. And I think, our Collab South is just one great example of how we make that happen. And so I'm getting the wrap up here, but I just want to mention one other thing. We've also worked with the city's purchasing department to prioritize when the city makes purchases that they support small businesses. And so in some cases, we have some priority procurement that happens with South Fulton-owned businesses and smaller businesses. So those are just creative ways that you can think about supporting businesses, small businesses in your communities. And our poll question, Lynn, do you want me to do the poll question?
We've run out of time.
Okay, good.
Everybody has such good things to say, and I want to make sure everybody has an opportunity. But we would like for you to put some thoughts into the chat. We haven't forgotten about you. There's so much good information going out there. If you can just put some thoughts about, again, remember our twofold process or twofold goal today was, one, to pull back that curtain on economic development, to hear some of the activities, and to help you think about how it is that you can engage as in your own capacity, whether you're a planner, nonprofit, official, city official, whomever you are, how is it that you can engage in these activities to support economic development and also create that dialogue? So we won't get a chance to discuss it, but because we need to move on. But the nice thing about this is that Kevin Johns is going to wrap us up with hopefully some nice, good, concrete, strategic thoughts about how you can engage. Please, I just saw one comment in the chat. I hope you all are still able to participate via the chat. And I will say, if there's something you'd like to know more about, please let us know. I know that they're going to be sending out a survey about the topic, anything that you want to learn more about. That's what the Community Planning Academy is really for. So I just, again, want, before we're going to wrap up, and I don't want to butt into Kevin's time, I want to thank all of the speakers today. They have been phenomenal in brainstorming this, helping us put together this insight into economic development and sharing their knowledge and their time. With that, I'm going to introduce Kevin Johns. He is the former Director of Economic Development for Austin, Texas. As the founder of Future Economies, Kevin leads global economies practice focused on transformational economic development in communities across the world. His philosophy is to use cultural diversity as an economic strength, both in the global marketplace and locally. He's currently working with the OAS, Organization of American States, to create resilient economies in the future of the Caribbean. So with that, I'm going to take that over at about 12:28, 29. I think Andrew's going to close it out for us. So I don't want to impede on Kevin's time. There you go. Thanks.
Hey, thank you very much, Lynn. Thank you to Steve Foster and Jeff Kosky, and also Nick with Sizemore for the last couple of weeks. I really appreciated this kind of inauguration into the planning community of Atlanta. In Austin, I was fortunate enough to be a Georgia Tech AIC planner who was in charge of the economy of the of the city at a time where it was very flat. 2009, 2010, the economy really was coming out of the first recession. And having a staff of 70 people doing economic development and a budget of 45 million, and divisions that did music and art and recruitment and small business, international trade, it gave me the perspective of what can be done and how you can measure the success as a city planner in a data-driven capacity and make headways into the audience that is not on our call today. Perhaps the audience that counts most, which is local elected officials, the business community, and all of the citizens. My take on city planning is that you all are the intelligentsia of city government. I think everybody looks at city planners and sees them as visionaries, as people who know how to build the future, who know how to build communities that are garden cities, that are walkable, where there's no poverty, and the cutting edge intellectuals in how to really build communities that are what everybody wants. I would say that the greatest deficiency we have is that when you look at comprehensive plans, you look at documents that are too often cookie cutter, that don't give you an understanding of what the real problems are that the community is looking at. Principally poverty, crime, taxes, with any kind of data-driven solutions built into the comprehensive plans. Now, the technology is there, the knowledge is there, but to be very, very useful as city planners in validating the vision and the intellectual prowess that you have to be able to develop a system that shows you what the return on investment is. And from my experience in Austin, which touches upon a lot of the what you've heard from Chris and Samir and Shirley Ann and everybody today, there is this wonderful toolkit, and there's a return on investment in each area, whether it's redevelopment or recruiting companies, whatever it is, there is an ROI. But the greatest ROI hasn't been really discussed today, and that is poverty. The elimination of youth poverty cuts off the supply of people into poverty in cities, which creates the costs in everything from public health to courts to police to public housing, all of the things that we need as a safety net, but essentially are unsustainable unless we lower the supply of people in poverty. And if you imagine that your own individual budgets, whether it's Cobb County with 10% poverty, what if that wasn't there? What would that budget look like? Or if it was Atlanta with which has 22% poverty, what if that was not there? So I encourage all the city planners as I go through these slides to think of the priorities of the people who are not on the call and how you can use your intellect and your knowledge to tap into database solutions that measure the return on investment, that show how to pay for the things that you want to do. So let me run through this. I did a real interesting study in Austin. I developed a system called the Einstein Project. We were using economic incentives and a loci analysis to recruit 22 companies. And the return on investment was 239%, Apple, Facebook, Samsung, Merck. And what I realized in looking at that 239% return on investment was that the largest investment was actually to get rid of people in poverty. And there is a perception that poverty is the job of people in housing or in social service delivery. And I would like to evolve you from that. So here's a few examples of strategies that I used in Austin. And I would say that working with the economic development community on incentive solutions is going to be very challenging because the economic development people, whether it's the chamber folks or whether it's the people at the state, quite often they see the city planning community as the regulatory policeman. And so you, in order to validate your ideas and the comprehensive plan and the strategies that you have, you need to use incentive solutions and software to come up with the financial argument that will force them to take serious your recommendations. I call this the math of poverty. When you look at the cost of poverty and then you subtract out that poverty from a government, you have an incredible amount of prosperity. So whether you're a land use planner or an educational planner or a transportation planner, look at the value add and look at partnerships with the economic community that can draw in people who will then help implement and pay for your ideas. The ROI, return on investment strategy, I'm not sure if we have the software hooked up here, but There's three that are the most important that all city planners should know how to use. ET, the Envision Tomorrow software, which you use on redevelopment, and it's an economic scenario planning tool that tells you how much money you're going to generate, what is it going to do to the family disposable income, how much taxes will be generated, how many jobs, before the government actually invests in the money. So it eliminates the economic blind side. The second is in incentives. Having been the lead negotiator in recruiting 22 companies, Apple, Facebook, Samsung, Merck, the most important thing in using a software, in this case LOCI, is you have to know how much money not to give. You have to know where the break-even points of all projects are cash positive. This is a natural for city planners. And then the last one is enterprise resource planning software. This tells you how to make all projects performance-based. Here's three examples of what I think are the top fusion of city plans, comprehensive plans, and economic development plans. Vancouver, this little block down here, gives you some highlights of how they're thinking. Very tactical, very performance-oriented, has the city planners embedded into the economic strategies to pay for things. The Toronto Economic Readiness Plan has won number of awards as the top economic plan. And I'd be remiss if I didn't put in the Austin Strategic Direction, which is a citywide strategic plan that implements. So you've heard several people wonderfully speak today, great speakers, that talked about, what are the planning tools we have? How do you measure? How do you justify? This is the taxes generated from Austin's downtown after our redevelopment. I think these kind of visual tools, these kind of examples will convince everybody that you need to put more money into the redevelopment. It's just an example. This tool on the left is the Envision Tomorrow software. I did a 2-minute music video on it, but unfortunately that's not here today. Economic placemaking. One of the things that we did in Austin very successfully that is seems like a natural fit here is to use cultural diversity as an economic strength. Now, we were able to fund Asian, Black, Hispanic, gay and lesbian chambers of commerce, and then commission them, contract with them to create culturally diverse business areas with their culture, with the music, with the food, and then tie that into both tourism and an evaluation of the taxes. And we grew them into TIFs or TADs, as you heard Jeff speak about. So they began throwing off money. We also contracted with each one of those chambers to connect to their brethren in other Science City locations around the world and develop a network of multinationals coming out of Austin from these designated business districts. One of the things that Metro Atlanta has that is really quite wonderful that I think could be taken advantage of by the city planning community is economic placemaking with the creative industries. In Austin, we were fortunate to have music as a huge, more live music venues than any other place in the country. But we also funded 500 arts communities. So 500 art nonprofits. So we use that for incentives. We would send musicians to Apple or to Facebook or to Google or to whomever we were recruiting. And we also joined the UN UNESCO Creative Cities program in a competitive way. But the creative industry, I commissioned a study, and during the last recession, 2005, 2010, the creative economy was creating $4.6 billion every year, 49,000 jobs, 71 million in taxes. So it's not to be ignored in your comprehensive plans, and it's not to be ignored in creating a 24-hour economy. It is a key aspect of negotiating with the private sector developers, with the economic development folks. Just some thoughts. The key driver of the American economy is innovation. And whether you think you are capable of using your community to grow innovation hubs or music districts, It is totally dependent upon your vision and how you create public-private partnerships to enact it. Public-private partnerships, unfortunately, are not taught in schools. It has to be learned, but they're incredible examples of how planners can work with the fiscal people, get everything they want in public-private partnerships, including innovation hubs. If there are innovation hubs throughout Metro Atlanta, then all of a sudden the image of Atlanta is a city, a science city of innovation. Instead of looking at the large number of children in poverty as people that are going to continue into poverty, look at that as an underutilized asset. Transform those kids into a tsunami of innovators. The way to do that is to incentivize the private sector to tutor them for careers that pay over $100,000. Any community can do that. Whether it's Fairburn, whether it's Alpharetta, whether it's Cobb County, whether it's Atlanta, harness the existing private businesses and you can create all of the economic development that you want. This is an example. There's two examples here. This is the former airport in Austin called Miller. And when I got there at the end of 2009, 2010, there was no development, but it had a beautiful plan. Its plan was neo-traditional, new urbanism, 25% of the community's housing had to be affordable, parks, just incredible vision. The master developer that was hired to build it out, that reported to me, was incentivized with performance measures so that the more they sold, the more they lived up to it, then the more that they made, that they financially made. It won the 2015 APA Secretary's Award as the best development in America. The 25% affordable housing is actually 28%. It has the most electric cars of any place in the country. So a tremendous success and billions of dollars in investment from $0, because it was, wasn't paying any taxes initially. The second and the last example is the Seaholm Eco District. This was the waterfront in Austin. It was an abandoned power plant, as you can see here in the foreground, and a water treatment plant. So, I mean, there was no taxes being generated, but a wonderful fusion of city planning and economic development created a visionary plan, but it also used a TAD or a TIF to figure out how to pay for it. The end result was this building, the old power plant, we incentivized a company, Athena Health, to invest $100 million of their own money and renovate it. Over Google, all with music, with buskers, with parks, with trails, and it's now a $2 billion development. As the 4 billion is 2 billion each, and $100 million of the profits from this have gone to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. So it is very possible to fuse economic development and city planning. You've heard, I think, a very good discussion of business retention and expansion efforts. Work with ED professionals to identify target industries. Do you know how to do that? Real easy. There's a software called Socrates. And if you use it, it'll tell you how many are advertised jobs in different professions are in your community or in the metro area. That's how I found out that there were 40,000 high-tech vacancies going unfilled in Austin, and there were 40,000 kids in poverty. And trying to connect the education to that economy would fill them. So I think that the point is there is also a software for this. There's also, if you're looking at cluster industry and you're trying to figure out what does that really mean, at Harvard University, Michael Porter has the cluster industry observatory, and you can kind of do an analysis, and there's a lot of really great firms here that do that kind of work as well. So opportunities for planners to engage. I'm not going to do the chat, obviously. But I would say that for city planners to get involved with the economic community, you have to find a way to join their organizations. The global organization is the International Economic Development Council, the Georgia Economic Development Council here. Get involved at early and often. Learn who and how they're actually doing the work. It'll make it much easier to support their businesses. This is a quick case study of the work that I accomplished in Austin. The Math of Poverty book is a good example of how to transform that. There's plenty of software. And the last thing is small businesses. There were 43,000 small businesses in Austin. We wanted to create self-sustaining commercial areas throughout the city. So we created merchants guilds and we funded them. And then they created merchants associations and grew into TIFs, so they were financially self-supporting. It won the Texas APA Award as the best small business city planning strategy. And we offered 21 online business acumen courses, not only to the businesses, but also to the artists and the musicians. And as in terms of workforce, I think that you've heard that from Rob, you've heard it from everybody. But the key ingredient of economic development and to create your city or county as a prosperity engine is human capital. You have to focus in your plans on everything in some element of moving the kids out of poverty and not into blue collar jobs, not into service industry jobs, which can be automated, but into jobs that are entrepreneurial, business, acumen driven jobs that pay over $100,000 a year. So I'm thanking the Sizemore Group and Lynn. Thank you so much for tolerating me here today in this little rant, but I've really enjoyed it. And Atlanta's a great community and there's some brilliant city planners out there that are gonna make the city, again, the global place for communities of the whole industry of communities around the world. It's a great place.
Thank you, Kevin. That was great. I think it really brought together some very concrete strategies and also some much bigger thinking. You know, there are, as you say, there's room for everybody. We do have needs for, you know, entry-level jobs all the way up to higher level, higher skill jobs to move folks out of poverty. So with that, this was a fantastic, fantastic day. At least I found it really helpful and enlightening, and I hope you all did as well. I want to profusely thank ARC for putting this on, and I hope you all got a lot out of it. We will be sending you a survey. We would love to hear from you if you have anything else that you want, that you're curious about, that you want us to expand on. You know, it's hard to cover everything, and yet barely scratched the surface in one session. So thank you all again for staying with us. It was an incredible turnout. We were really delighted to see so many people interested in the topic. And I think with that, I'll let you go. It's 12:30. Again, thank you, and feel free to reach out to all of us. We'll send you the slides and a link to the presentation and everybody's contact information if you like it.
Is it an open bar, Lynn?
Sorry?
Is it an open bar now?
Yes, go to your bar. It's open. Go have some lunch. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.